for many, many years. And to our returning members, thank you for your continued service and partnership. And to our new members, Senator Mullen, Senator Budd, and Senator Schmidt, welcome. I look forward to working with each of you. Okay. Now, I have been informed, since we have a quorum, and that's transitory, since the quorum is now present, I ask the committee to consider 1,790 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee their required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report this list of 1,790 pending military nominations to the Senate?
So moved.
Is there a second? Thank you very much. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. Thank you. And returning now to my comments. We're lucky to have our extremely talented witnesses with us today, and we understand there are significant challenges facing us, from China's growing influence to Russia's reckless aggression. Our nation faces a complex and dangerous security environment. Prevailing in this environment will require thoughtful, resolute strategies informed by experts like those before us today. Dr. Bonny Lynn is the director of the China Power Project and senior fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's an expert on U.S. military strategy in the Indo-Pacific, with leadership experience across the Department of Defense and with the RAND Corporation. Dr. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Hill has served as the top advisor for European and Russian policy on the National Security Council and is an expert on issues related to Russia, Central Asia, energy, and strategic competition. Mr. Roger Zakheim is the director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. He is an expert on U.S. defense strategy, having served as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee and other national security positions. He currently serves on the 2022 National Defense Strategy Commission. Our objective today is to examine the national security issues that this committee should consider as we prepare for the fiscal year 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. As the Biden administration's national defense strategy makes clear, China is our primary competitor. It is the only nation with both the intent and the capability to mount a sustained challenge to the security and economic interests of the United States and its allies and partners around the world. At the same time, Russia remains a violent, destabilizing force. Putin's assault on Ukraine has inflicted horrific suffering on innocent civilians seeking a free and democratic society. It's threatened European stability and harmed the global economy. In addition, nations like Iran and North Korea continue to push the boundaries of military brinksmanship, and issues like terrorism and climate change remain persistent. The significance of these threats is widely understood. The question is how to address them in order to deter or mitigate the threat to U.S. national security and international stability more broadly. To begin, we have to recognize that America faces an existential struggle between democracy and autocracy. Beijing and Moscow seek to change the international order by exploiting vulnerable nations through coercive economic and military pressure. America must offer an alternative to this kind of foreign policy. Given the economic, cultural, and geographic ties between many of our partners in China, we can't ask them to choose between engaging with the United States or China based solely on an economic or military calculation. We should use all our tools of statecraft and build mutually beneficial relationships. Indeed, forging and maintaining strong international partnerships is likely to be the decisive factor in any future conflict. We have seen this through Ukraine's remarkable performance against Russia, and it will hold true also in the Pacific. Our greatest comparative advantage over China is our network of allies, and strengthening that network should be at the center of our strategy moving forward. The development of the Quad involving the United States, Japan, India, and Australia presents a valuable framework. Similarly, our defense agreement with Australia and the United Kingdom, known as AUKUS, provides an excellent platform for improving the capabilities of our allies and increasing our engagement in the region. Our adversaries' presence around the globe is evolving. I would ask our witnesses to share their assessment of the Ukraine conflict in the larger context of the evolving international order, as well as the implications for U.S. defense strategy going forward. Similarly, I would like to know what military and non-military factors are most likely to impact Chinese decision-making with respect to potential aggression against Taiwan. As the recent shoot-down of the Chinese surveillance balloon in our airspace should remind us, the top priority of the national defense strategy is homeland defense. America's skies and seas must be secure to protect its citizens, and the Department must pursue technologies that provide forward detection to buy decision time for decision makers. Finally, as we adapt to meet these global challenges, we need to consider that we are entering an era of trilateral nuclear competition. The Cold War was essentially a bilateral rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, which developed deterrence theory and communications methods based on two competitors. That has changed with the ascendancy of China and its growing nuclear arsenal. I would ask our witnesses to help us understand this new trilateral dynamic and how it may impact efforts to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Ultimately, long-term strategic competition is not just a rivalry of military or economic power, but also a competition of ideas. This requires us to develop an understanding of our adversary's strengths, weaknesses, philosophies, and objectives, as well as our own. This is where the knowledge and insights of the experts before us today are so valuable. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony, and I thank them again for their participation. And let me now recognize and turn to the ranking member, Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you for once again holding the position of chair of this important committee. As ranking member, I hope to and expect to continue the great bipartisanship that's become a tradition of this body. Also, let's take a moment to salute my predecessor, the Honorable Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. He left us Oklahoma-sized cowboy boots to fill, and we're going to do our best to carry his legacy forward with a relentless focus on supporting the men and women who protect America every day. I want to salute and recognize the invaluable contributions of our returning members and welcome 3 new members of our committee. Senator Mullen from Oklahoma, Senator Budd from North Carolina, and Senator Schmidt from Missouri. Their states play a critical role in defending our nation. Also, there are a number of service members and veterans there. And particularly, I'll say to Mr. Budd, my first active duty station as then Captain Wicker was Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. So I hope you'll look out for my buddies there at Seymour Johnson as well as the entire military. Today's hearing is an important opportunity to speak with experts, and so we welcome them, particularly important as we begin to craft this year's National Defense Authorization Act, hopefully earlier than usual. The United States faces an increasingly complex and dangerous security environment. Indeed, it is fair to say that this is the most dangerous moment since the Cold War. The Chinese Communist Party is engaged in a massive project of military modernization, and its threat to unify, as they say, and I would say invade Taiwan, becomes clearer every day. Nearly 1 year ago, Beijing's junior partner, Russia, launched an unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. This war poses a direct threat to peace and prosperity on the European continent and to America's vital economic and security interests. Moscow's war machine in Ukraine is aided by Iran. In addition to supplying Russia with lethal drones, Iran continues to spread mayhem elsewhere as it marches closer toward a nuclear weapons capability. Iran's volatility and malign influence is matched by North Korea. The 38th parallel remains one of the most dangerous places in the world. Further, we cannot take our eye off the global war on terror. Global terrorist organizations continue to recruit, train, and operate in the greater Middle East and beyond, and pose a direct threat to us here in our homeland. Our first job in this committee is to provide the tools our military needs to deter and defeat these threats. There's no doubt that continued real growth in the defense budget, top line, above inflation, real growth above inflation is an absolute necessity, of bare necessity. We are in the crucial years of this military competition, and we cannot afford to let our guard down, Mr. Chairman. This committee led the bipartisan charge to increase the defense budget in last year's cycle, a successful effort. I hope our witnesses will provide their views on the defense budget top line and the need to resource our war fighters, as well as initial thoughts on how to tackle the manifold threats we face from adversaries abroad. The war in Ukraine illustrates the importance of properly funding our military. On a bipartisan basis, Congress has provided billions of dollars of equipment and munitions to help the Ukrainian armed forces defend their country's sovereignty and independence. Although we have provided considerable resources, I remain disappointed that the administration has been hesitant to provide Ukraine with advanced capabilities to secure victory. Time and again, the administration's reluctance to provide rapid delivery of critical capabilities, Stingers, Javelins, HIMARS, and Abrams, to name a few, has cost the Ukrainians valuable time. It has led to the protracted battle of attrition we may be seeing today. So I would ask our witnesses to comment on the war and suggest ways that this committee can continue to help the brave and steadfast Ukrainian troops actually win, rather than preserve a stalemate. Now, here at home, the war in Ukraine has exposed shortcomings in our defense industrial base and supply chains. Expanding our lines of production, especially for critical munitions, should continue to be a priority this year. I would welcome our witnesses' perspective on this issue and how it applies to the Taiwan situation. The defense industrial base is not only important for today's fight in Ukraine, but of supreme importance for the competition with the Chinese Communist Party. Both the Trump and Biden administrations have placed strategic competition with China as the top priority for the national defense strategy. The previous Republican administration and the current Democratic administration have been together on this issue. Winning this competition will require a significant investment in developing and fielding game-changing technologies that will keep us a step ahead of Beijing. In addition to developing transformational technology, outcompeting China will require increased production of platforms and weapon systems such as our battle fleet of ships. Congress proved last year that it could take bold steps to advantage the United States by passing the CHIPS and Science Act. We would be interested in our witnesses' views on how this committee can help the Department of Defense focus on the long-term strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party in this respect. So I thank our witnesses. I thank the indulgence of my friend, the chair. I would note that the namesake of Mr. Zakheim's institute, President Reagan, summed up his national security policy as peace through strength. And I hope all of my colleagues continue to keep that motto in mind as we embark on this very important year. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Dr. Lynn, please.
Thank you. Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the Senate Committee on Armed Services, thank you for the opportunity today to testify at this important hearing. I will focus on three issues: the nature of the PRC challenge, what the United States is doing, and how China is responding. The 2022 U.S. National Security Strategy appropriately identifies China as the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it. China continues to coerce U.S. allies and partners. China continues to engage in rapid military modernization of its conventional and nuclear capabilities to become a world-class military on par with the United States by 2049. On critical global challenges such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's role remains problematic. The difficulty of dealing with China is magnified by Xi Jinping's dismantling of collective political leadership and establishment of himself as the sole leader of China. With respect to the U.S. approach to the PRC, the Biden administration has identified and made significant progress in three areas: invest, align, and compete. First, the Biden administration has worked with Congress to invest over $1 trillion at home to improve U.S. economic innovation and competitiveness. This includes the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, 2022 CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Second, the United States has strengthened its unique advantage we have over the PRC, our alliances and partnerships. For example, Japan now not only shares a common strategic vision with the United States, but is also committed to do far more than its own defense. Australia has agreed to enhance force posture cooperation and more U.S. rotational presence. The Philippines has provided the United States with access to 4 additional military locations. The United States has resumed large-scale military drills with South Korea. The Biden administration is also facilitating greater cooperation between allies and partners. This includes the U.S., Japan, Australia, and U.S., Japan, ROK Trilateral Cooperation, AUKUS, and the Quad. NATO is also increasingly engaging with Indo-Pacific countries. Third, and central to the U.S. approach to the PRC is the need to outcompete China. DoD has prioritized the PRC as the pacing challenge and Taiwan contingency as the pacing scenario. The Department of Defense is improving U.S. posture and presence, logistics and pre-position material, and infrastructure throughout the Indo-Pacific. The United States is enhancing joint allied and partner capabilities, increasing training and information sharing, and co-developing critical and emerging technologies. DoD is also investing in new operational concepts to fight in a highly contested environment. The Biden administration has made clear that engagement with China is necessary to prevent competition from spiraling into conflict. However, U.S. engagement efforts to date are prone to disruption, and the PRC continues to stonewall calls for critical dialogues. Overall, the U.S. approach towards the PRC has encouraged Beijing to compete more against the United States and our allies and partners. The PRC blames the United States and our allies and partners for what it views as its deteriorating security environment and does not view its behavior as problematic. We have not seen any clear indicators of dampening PRC ambitions or activities. There is a real risk that Beijing could miscalculate, and intensified U.S.-China competition could lead to confrontation. Moving forward, the United States needs to continue to deepen our alliances and partnerships and strengthen this critical advantage that we have. The Biden administration also needs to bolster its economic strategy towards the PRC. If joining the CPTPP is completely off the table, the United States should look at other bilateral or multilateral arrangements. The United States should also continue to work with our coalition of friends to counter PRC economic coercion. The United States also needs to continue to invest in our military to ensure that DoD has the resources needed to train and invest in our capabilities to deny PRC aggression and to build a more resilient and dispersed U.S. posture. And finally, the United States needs to maintain high-level engagements with China and expand people-to-people contacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Dr. Hill, please.
Thank you so much, Chairman Reid and Senator Wicker. It's a great honour to be with you, my fellow witnesses and the members of the committee today. Before I begin my opening remarks, I'd just like to flag that I have a new article in Foreign Affairs with my colleague Angela Stent on this very topic, and I would just ask that that could be submitted for the record so the members and staff could read it later.
Without objection.
Thank you. I want to focus on one specific challenge in my opening remarks and look forward to answering the questions that you and Senator Wicker laid out in your opening statements. But first of all, just as you, Senator Reid, emphasised in your introduction, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was an assault on the post-World War II global order. And the war in Ukraine has necessitated the third intervention by the United States in a European conflict in a little over a century, and what will now likely be our third attempt at revamping the international security system. Now, this world order wasn't just our order, but a set of rules that all nations, including Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, had agreed to. Russia violated the United Nations Charter and fundamental principles of international law by attacking an independent state that had been recognized by all the international community, including Russia itself, for more than 30 years. So the current challenge in Europe is how to craft a more durable regional security arrangement that rolls back Russia's land grab in Ukraine, is embraced by all Europeans, and sets a precedent for reinvigorating the largest set of international agreements. We need to find a formula that's not entirely dependent on the military and economic power of the United States or its political leadership to ensure long-term success. The European security environment was irrevocably altered or ruptured in 2014 when Russia annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and sparked off a brutal conflict and proxy war in the Donbass region. None of the United States and Europe's mechanisms and practices for keeping the peace after World War II and during the Cold War had much, if any, effect on deterring Russia from seizing Crimea in 2014 or attempting to take Kiev and the rest of Ukraine in 2022. Western deterrence failed in part because American and European policymakers never meaningfully emphasized the West's red lines. Indeed, one might even ask, what were our red lines? Because we certainly did not appear to uphold the post-World War II principle of ensuring independent state sovereignty and territorial integrity after 2014. And instead, European leaders, led by Germany and France, rushed to push Russia's annexation of Crimea to one side and broker a quick peace settlement in Donbass, the Minsk Accords, which would have limited Ukraine's sovereignty if fully implemented. The tepid Western political response to Russia's violation of Ukraine's territory and the limited application of sanctions after this first invasion convinced Moscow that attacking Ukraine was not, in fact, a serious breach of post-World War II norms. And Western commentary since 2014 has more frequently focused on the risk of stepping over Russia's red lines rather than enforcing the West's. We've spent more time contemplating the perils of provoking Russia's mercurial President Vladimir Putin than the merits of bolstering Europe's resilience to Putin's coercive power. In charting a path forward, we need to recognize that the war in Ukraine has been brewing for decades because of a key distinction in the way that the international community and the United States approached the collapse of the Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. In the case of Yugoslavia, the country was dissolved without the recognition of a single successor state. Serbia's territorial claims against all of its neighbours were rejected. In the case of the USSR, the United States and every other country recognized Russia as the sole successor state. Moscow inherited the Soviet Union's UN Security Council seat and its other privileges and obligations, as well as, it seemed, the Soviet Union's Cold War sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Ukraine, along with all the other former Soviet republics, fell into a grey zone, where Russia's interests seemed to trump theirs, and they were deemed by all of us Russia's near abroad. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly stated that Moscow has the right to dominate this neighbourhood and claim lost territory. For Putin, the war in Ukraine is a continuation of the Soviet struggle with the United States to carve up Europe after 1945. Russia sees NATO as a US Cold War bloc, a cover for American imperialism, and not as an alliance of equals to ensure common defence and security. So in this context, for Russia, NATO's post-Cold War expansion and Ukraine's reluctance to implement the Minsk Accords in Donbass became the current war's casus belli. So redefining European security and restoring deterrence will involve explicitly countering this narrative, building an international coalition against Russia's aggression to facilitate the eventual settlement of the war in Ukraine will require the same. The US and its allies must clarify and emphasize that they are supporting Ukraine on the battlefield to uphold the United Nations Charter and international law. We need to step up our diplomatic efforts, including in the UN, to convince friends and middle powers in the so-called global south that our goal is not to retain Western supremacy, but to keep the world safer for every nation. If Russia succeeds in carving up Ukraine, then the future sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states could be imperiled. So upholding international norms must once again be a central part of our global security strategy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. Mrs. Zakheim, please.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on global security challenges and strategy. Less than a year ago, I had the honor of testifying before this committee when, as many of you will recall, the world witnessed Russia's massive military convoy assembled on the road to Kyiv. 1 year later, that convoy of armor and steel is no more. The Russian military failed to seize Kyiv, and Ukrainians are valiantly fighting to preserve their freedom and sovereignty. We have learned a lot in a year, some of which is worth reviewing as we consider the state of our national security strategy and the efficacy of the national defense strategy. First, We've learned that supporting Ukraine with military capabilities necessary to defend their sovereign territory will not lead to escalation or spillover. Instead, Western support has helped transform the battlefield, badly damaging Russia's military capabilities and moderated, for now, Putin's military objectives. Going forward, our support to Ukraine, be it with tanks, drones, aircraft, or missiles, should be tailored to executing a counter-offensive strategy that rolls back Russia's gains and restores Ukraine's sovereign territory. We've also learned that the war in Ukraine has revealed how the digital age is leveling the playing field between great powers and smaller countries. Ukraine has skillfully deployed precision munitions, drone technology, and sophisticated encrypted software to gain the upper hand against Russia's invading conventional military. But while Russia's military conventional force is badly damaged, it is not defeated. We stand at the precipice of a new stage in the war where Ukraine will need tanks and other conventional offensive platforms in order to dislodge entrenched Russian forces. Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrates that conventional forces still matter. Submarines, tanks, fighting, bombers, munitions, and end strength cannot be sacrificed in favor of a future capability that merely exists on a PowerPoint slide. We need to sustain our conventional capability to prevail in today's conflicts. Third, industrial capacity may be America's Achilles heel as we implement our national defense strategy. As Ranking Member Wicker pointed out, this is a key area of focus for this committee. Just-in-time manufacturing, in which products are made only to meet existing immediate demand, may make business sense for big box stores and their suppliers, but the war in Ukraine makes clear that just-in-time means out of time on the battlefield. The effort to deploy, arm, feed, and supply forces is a monumental task, and the massive consumption of equipment, systems, vehicles, and munitions requires a large-scale industrial base for resupply. These takeaways lead to a more general observation that realizing the objectives of our national defense strategy requires a builder's mindset. Now is the time to build a force capable of winning today and tomorrow. The challenge before this committee is to ensure the NDS is executed. To do so, I recommend the following steps, which I outline in depth in my written testimony, which I hope is considered for the record. Number one, prioritize winning today by countering China. Number two, investing in winning tomorrow. And three, resourcing the demands of the national defense strategy. China's recent brazen breach of U.S. airspace is just the latest case of aggressive and provocative actions by the CCP. The primary test of the NDS is whether we are able to deter China from seizing control of Taiwan and arrest its pursuit of hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. Its actions in the Taiwan Strait, combined with its robust military modernization program, suggest Beijing is considering this sooner rather than later. While we've made, and this committee has done, a remarkable job of progress in areas of warfighting that are relevant to the Taiwan scenario, more is needed for other high-end munitions relevant in the Western Pacific. While our force must be capable of deterring adventurism in the present competition with China, it must also be prepared for future 21st century conflict. We are far below the scale of investment required to replace air, land, and sea platforms with AI-infused autonomous systems. In comparison, as this committee knows, China is rapidly incorporating the achievements of its commercial sector into its military modernization. Not since the Reagan administration has our country committed itself to sustained multi-year rebuilding of our military. Executing this defense strategy, one, as was pointed out, is aligned between the Trump and Biden administrations, requires a jump from today's spending levels of just 3% GDP to what I believe around 5% GDP. As Congress debates how to manage spending amidst the debt ceiling negotiations, it should be mindful that cutting defense to FY22 levels, which would be about 10% to the top line, would render the defense strategy non-executable. It would reduce our military to nothing more than a regional force. Our defense strategy seeks to preserve American peace and prosperity by building and sustaining the U.S. military that maintains what President Reagan called the margin of safety. Notably, this is not the most ambitious defense strategy. It does not seek military dominance everywhere, nor does it call for a force capable of winning two conflicts simultaneously. Rather, it is a strategy prudently tailored to address the security needs of the country, not the political calculus of the moment, ensuring no foreign power threatens our interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zakheim. Thank you, all the witnesses, for your excellent testimony, and all of your written statements will be made part of the record without objection. Thank you. Dr. Hill, President Putin has made several speeches over the years where he has made it clear he wants to restore the Russian Empire. So if he succeeds in the Ukraine, can we have reasonable certainty he'll continue these efforts in other countries?
I think, Senator Reid, that we can. He's already made it very clear, as you've discussed, that he's interested in reacquiring territory in what was the space of the former Russian Empire. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we recognize Russia as the successor state to the Soviet Union, which was itself the successor state to the Russian Empire, and in fact reincorporated many of the territories that were lost after the Russian Revolution. So Putin has made it very clear, of course, the priorities of the Slavic states, Belarus and Ukraine, but also Moldova. And we've just heard recently in the last few days, I'm sure people have been reading the press reports, that the Moldovan government feels under incredible strain and has been getting intel itself that Russia is planning, some kind of aggression against them. And of course, also Kazakhstan, because northern Kazakhstan was settled by Slavs, Ukrainians and Russians in the Soviet period. So all of those countries feel a great deal of anxiety. We can also say, of course, that our allies and partners in Poland, the Baltic states, which were forcibly taken into the Soviet Union during World War II, Finland, which was attacked by the Soviet Union in 1939-1940, and other countries in the neighbourhood feel similarly threatened by this expansionary nature of Russian aims. And Putin has said the world needs to get used to the fact that Russia is territorially expanding again. And in fact, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has demanded that the rest of Europe accept these new realities. So even if we were to have a settlement based on some kind of recognition of the frontier lines that are now holding on the front, even a temporary one, we should be very certain that Russia under Putin and the people around him will look for every opportunity to push beyond that at some time in the future. In fact, that's what we've seen in Ukraine from the beginning. 2014 was the beginning of a process, not the end of Russia's territorial aims.
Now, you mentioned settlement. Can you give us any indication of what it would take to get Putin to sit down and have some type of settlement?
Well, right now there's not much indication of that, just to be frank. I mean, I think this is a pretty grim picture, in part because Putin didn't feel deterred in the first place, as I think all of us have mentioned here. The other thing is that Putin also feels that he has a lot of support from the rest of the world, including from China. And I think it would be very interesting to hear from Dr. Lynn about really what China's views of this are now, because unfortunately it may very well take countries like China pushing Russia for there to be any break in Putin's resolve at this particular moment. It would have to be, I think, other countries beyond the United States and its Western allies demonstrating to Putin in some fashion behind the scenes or more directly that this war is not in their interest and that they want him to move towards the negotiating table. Right now, the circumstances on the ground are such that Putin really believes that he can push more manpower there. And this gets back to what Mr. Zakheim was already saying about the importance of looking at the battlefield. But we need to have a diplomatic initiative. We need to get the rest of the international community behind us in support of pushing Russia back.
Thank you. And I always recognize an excellent question. So, Dr. Lynn, can you comment upon the Chinese reaction to Ukraine, and particularly their willingness at some point to step up and help contain? I would note that they've made statements against the use of nuclear weapons, which are somewhat encouraging. Dr. Lynn.
Sure, thank you. Senator Reid, if you recall, at the very beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the position that China took was, I would say, very, very much pro-Russia. Today, China's position is still that the United States and our NATO allies are responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what we're seeing is some shift since last year of China's position in terms of not fully taking Russia's position politically, as China wants to salvage its relationship with particularly our European colleagues. We're also seeing that there is increasing reporting of Chinese support by select smaller Chinese companies for example, providing of surveillance equipment for the Wagner Group, as well as Russian operations in Ukraine. And we also know that China's trade with Russia increased 34% last year. So as we move forward, I think one thing we need to pay attention to is what might push China more in Russia's direction. And I worry that as China looks at how strong our position is with our allies and partners, China might feel it needs a stronger partner internationally, and it doesn't have too many options. And Russia is unfortunately one of the partners that China is keen to keep.
Dr. Zakheim, Mr. Zakheim, excuse me, I get confused. Can you comment briefly, very briefly, because my time's running out, about the issue of the dynamic between China and Russia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the elevation. We saw that around the Winter Olympics, and they made this explicit when Putin and Xi met. We're not seeing it on the operational side in terms of the military support like we're seeing between Iran and Russia, but I think, as my colleague pointed out, it's the diplomatic support, legitimizing, equivocating in terms of what is and is not permissible, is where China, I think, is helping Russia the most. Legitimizing war crimes would be the first example I'd point to.
Thank you very much. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, you participated in the current development of the National Defense Strategy and the previous National Defense Strategy. Is that correct?
I had the opportunity to be on the Defense Strategy Commission, which reviewed the former one, and we'll review the present one. In your testimony, you make a case for real growth in the defense budget. That's real purchasing power over and above what's being taken out by inflation. And you talk about measuring our defense contribution in terms of a percentage of the GDP. Why is that a good way to measure it? And you talked toward the end of your testimony, your written testimony, about how we can do that and still achieve some real savings and efficiencies. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. GDP, I think, is just a good way to look historically of what our country, our nation, has devoted to national defense. As you know, we're below 3.5% GDP and declining in the out years. Historically, we have been over 10%. During the Reagan build-up, we were between 5 and 6%. And I think the combination in terms of where our military is today, and that is a force that hasn't actually been modernized since the Reagan build-up, for a variety of reasons, either peace dividends or what we've spent on armed conflict, plus inflationary challenges, plus the national security environment, which my colleagues have outlined in their testimony, requires doing this. And I think there are three fundamental pieces here that are required. I think of it as winning today, which is taking our conventional force and upgrading it. I think it's leveraging the technologies that will transform our militaries, that China's doing as well. That requires a whole new suite of investments led by autonomy in every domain of warfare. And the third, as you've pointed out and led on us, Senator Wicker, industrial capacity. The reality that we've seen from Ukraine will play out. We're seeing it right now in terms of the backlog in supporting Taiwan. And what we need for our own national defense, we just don't have the industrial capacity to keep up. You add all three of them, Chairman, Ranking Member, I wouldn't disagree with you, but I'm not sure 5% real growth is enough to get there. And what I'm trying to get to is what the National Defense Strategy actually calls for. This is what the defense strategy says it seeks to do in terms of leading in 3 regions of the world, being able to compete today and to prevail in one conflict while holding another adversary, preventing a second conflict. To do all that requires a force that we simply don't have today and capabilities we don't have enough of today.
Well, that's a very important statement you just made. So it really is, in terms of what we need, we need to quantify exactly what we need to buy in the near and foreseeable future. And that might be more than 5%.
I believe so, Chair, as Ranking Member Wicker and Chairman Reed. I think this committee, what you've done in terms of adding to the defense request has gone a long way. And I know it's hard to do, but I don't believe it's sufficient.
Dr. Hill, what about that?
Well, I obviously planning ahead and trying to foresee where we might end up is pretty difficult, given, as Mr. Zakheim is talking about, the capacity issues that have been revealed by the war in Ukraine. I mean, right now, unfortunately, it's very hard to say how long this is going to continue. But I think, one thing that we do have to factor in here is, sadly listening to Dr. Lynn, it seems more and more likely that China and Russia will find their interests converging, as they already have up until this date, that we might be actually dealing with problems on two fronts for a long time to come. I think, something to add to what Dr. Lynn said is China has no interest in Russia losing in this war, and in fact might have a vested interest in this war going on in Ukraine as long as possible, because of course it does take up a large amount of equipment and armaments, particularly ammunition, as we now know, and then the increasing demands from Ukraine, which are tied very much to the battlefield for other equipment. We've seen our other allies from Europe, not just NATO countries, but others, stepping up to assist Ukraine here too. So there's a question about their production capacity, and I think that we should factor in as well what the European militaries are going to require too, because they're also dependent on our production.
Do you agree that the Russian offensive seems to have stalled, and if there were a successful counteroffensive by Ukraine in the next 2 to 3 months, China would pay attention to that and perhaps alter their ambitions? It's
possible. I think, again, we know that it's extraordinarily difficult now for the Ukrainians to dislodge the Russians from certain of the positions. They've dug in very heavily in Zaporizhia and Kherson. We're seeing this World War I-like fighting on the front line in the Donbass region. I think all of us, in looking at this, not just military experts, but others, see that this is going to be quite a grind. And I think, China obviously is watching this very closely. The situation in Taiwan is quite difficult. I mean, this is a maritime challenge, not one of land warfare. And actually, one thing to bear in mind is the Russian Navy has not really been affected by this. And, we're seeing these joint naval exercises with South Africa. That's why I mentioned the importance of getting to middle powers and other, friends in the global South with China and Russia that might show, different kinds of offensives or actions that Russia could take to distract us from what's happening in Ukraine. As I said, this is an extraordinarily difficult situation that we're in, but I think we would make a mistake if we think of China and what Russia is doing as two separate things. I think right now they're melded together. We have to have a 360-degree perspective around this, including what our other allies and partners can bring to the table.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. I want to drill down on this convergence of China, Russia, Iran, and the concerns that you've all expressed about how these world powers are aligning. China has been projecting power in many ways for a long time, the last 10 or 15 years. Their doubling of their military budget, their investment in Belt and Road Initiative to create bases, create opportunities worldwide to project their power. Russia has been projecting its power through an invasion of Ukraine, what they're doing in Moldova right now, a constant push of their power. And Iran has been projecting its power through conflict, through the use of proxies, through constant malign activities. And so I'd like your recommendations on the best way to try to create a deterrence, a stronger deterrence against conflict, ways to establish the future or path to peace with all of these different regions. And specifically with addressing China, Dr. Lynn, you talked about building up our allies, our partners, to maximize our deterrence capabilities and demonstrate a united front in the region. I'd love some more specific ideas about how best to do that, whether that means basing agreements, forward deployments, whether that means any other alignment that you think is useful as a way to promote deterrence. I'd also like to hear about ways that we may be able to deter Iran and Russia. One of the ideas I'd like your thoughts on is the Abraham Accords specifically as a way to create a regional alliance across the Middle East against Iran, to counter Iran, and also to push those Middle East countries from aligning with China. Because when we are absent, the gap is filled, and we don't want that gap being filled by China. Many of our allies, that gap was filled by Russia. Russia gives them their weapons, Russia makes different kinds of investments, and when we don't participate in these international agreements and collaborations, the gap is filled by unfortunately, others who do not align with our interests or values. So I'd like your thoughts on each of these questions and your best recommendations for how do we create long-term alignments for peace, how do we deter conflict, especially with China and especially with Iran in the future.
Thank you, Senator. I can take a quick stab at the range of questions, excellent questions that you had. You mentioned the China, Russia, Iran alignment. I would just note that the stronger of them is between China and Russia, whereas the China-Iran one is one that's still growing. And if you look today, the Iranian president is actually in China meeting with Xi Jinping. And one of the reasons why he is there is because of the fact that he wants to make sure that China can move as fast as possible on the major agreements that were signed last year. But he also recognizes that China is trying to do somewhat of a balancing act in the Middle East with the fact that China is heavily dependent on oil from Saudi Arabia and also recently signed major agreements with the Gulf Cooperation Council. So I would just note that the China-Iran relationship is one to watch, but I don't think it is from China's view, as strategically important as Russia right now, given the fact that Russia is significantly much more powerful than Iran, and also the fact that Russia is China's neighbor. In terms of what the United States can do to further bolster our alliances and partnerships, what we already have many developments underway. A couple that I'll highlight that I think are worth very much following up on is recently we saw the greater alignment between NATO and 4 East Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And my understanding is NATO seeks to normalize that. We should try to support that as much as possible, increasing, as Dr. Hill mentioned, increasing the linkages between our European allies and partners and our critical allies in the Indo-Pacific. I would also note there's been consideration of whether Japan might join AUKUS. All of these developments that we already have underway, we should continue. For example, the U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral, the U.S., ROK, Japan trilateral, all of these are incredibly important in terms of our positioning in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
I would like to agree with what my colleague Dr. Lynn has just said about the importance of creating all the linkages with the various alliance structures and partnerships that we already have. One of the things that I perhaps should have mentioned, before about Russia's aims throughout this war in Ukraine have been to create new alliances for Russia as well. As Dr. Lynn pointed out, Russia is one of the few close partners of China at this point, but that's the same for Russia. And although Russia has emphasized a great deal in terms of partnership building in Middle East, for example, and other parts of East Asia and Latin and South America, trying to revitalize old Soviet ties, the close relationship between Russia and Iran has been a problem there. And Senator, as you pointed out with the Abraham Accords, one of the main factors for those accords was, of course, opposition to Iran and Iran's role in the region. And if Russia remains the only power that has relations with Iran, that will actually become a problem in its other relationships over time, including with Israel and some of its other close partners, the UAE, for example. So I think we do absolutely have to find ways in which we can work with these sort of middle powers and others that, so far are trying to sit on the fence and, watch this from a distance because they frankly don't want to choose sides. India, is one of those countries that has a crisis at the moment because India's relationships with Russia were an important counterpart for India against China. And of course, the closer that China and Russia pull together, the more untenable India's own security position becomes. We should also pay attention to the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, in India, I've already said, in China and South Africa. I mentioned already this, the new naval exercises that South Africa and Russia and China are conducting. I mean, we should make it very clear to South Africa that that's just not acceptable. And other countries should be doing that too. It shouldn't just be the United States stepping out there. We've just had President Biden visiting with President Lula in Brazil. Brazil is eager to take a larger international role. We should try to capitalize upon that. We need to really think about how we can reinvigorate our own relationships with middle powers and countries in all of the key areas of Asia, Latin, South America, and Africa. So that should be part of our strategy. And one area in which we could focus on this, it's not perhaps in the mandate of this particular committee, but is focusing on the combination of fuel, food, and fertilizer. Because one of the key things that we've seen as a result of this war in Ukraine is how important Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, the Black Sea are for global food supplies, fertilizer, which is of course tied together, and also flows of fuel. And this is where we really have a lot of leverage with other powers, because they've been dependent on all of those flows and have been very concerned about the impact of this war. And this also includes China, which was a major investor in Ukraine prior to the outbreak of war, particularly in the agricultural sector. So there may be something there that we can look at as a recommendation for emphasizing in our outreach.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Mrs. Zakheim, for the record, you can submit something if you would. Thank you. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, what do you see as being the primary lessons learned from the war in Ukraine thus far?
The number one lesson is that we should stand and will advance our interest by standing with Ukraine. That aggression needs to be countered, and if we do so, that is not going to be escalatory, but in fact stabilizing. And I think the best thing we can do for our national security interests is to see Russia defeated in Ukraine. And this committee and this Congress has done a lot to support Ukraine in realizing that. I think we have to stop measuring our support for Ukraine by the particular weapons platform that's on the table and think more broadly and strategically. What is our aim? What is our goal? The goal is to roll back Russia, to support Ukraine in their counteroffensive, and we should be supporting them with the necessary munitions and platforms to realize that objective. That will return security and stability to Europe and deter Vladimir Putin. He has never been deterred because he has never had to deal with a counter to his aggression. We've talked about 2014 in Crimea. As the senator knows, started in 2008 with Georgia. This is the first time we've had the counter, and we need to pull it and support it through to the end.
One thing that I have been focused on from the very beginning is our munitions capacity and the production that we see. When you say, I thought you kind of glossed over that on your answer, and I think there is a real and urgent need to expand munition production capacity as quickly as possible, not just to address the ongoing war that we see in Ukraine. What additional steps do you think you would recommend to Congress to consider to overcome our current limitations that we have on that capacity?
Well, Senator, I agree with you, and I did not mean to gloss it over. In fact, I share your view that this is an urgent problem. It's an urgent problem in Ukraine. It's an urgent problem in Taiwan. And many of those munitions and capabilities, we not only need in those two theaters, but we also need here at home. And as you're fully aware, we don't have that capacity, both in terms of what we need for current scenario planning and also for surge capacity. I think this committee started it in this past year's National Defense Authorization Bill, but it's limited. The most important thing this Congress can do, and I know I'm preaching the converted here on the authorizing committee, but multi-year procurement. I think you solve a lot of this if you're able to buy things over the course of 3-4 years. You'd make it cheaper. You know, that's an efficiency that I know Senator Wicker's focused on, other members of this committee. But it's scale. It's scale and industrial capacity. This is capital-intensive investments, not just to get the particular munition that can be produced on the current production line, but it's multiple production lines. And Senator, as you know, it's not just about munitions. The most important capability for a Taiwan scenario, and I assume Dr. Lynn would agree, is our undersea capability. And we are retiring our undersea capability at a faster rate than we're producing them. That, in its essence, is a capital problem around industrial capacity, Senator.
I agree with you, and that was the reason that I was able to get the amendment in the NDAA to address that problem specifically. On this committee, and this is for all of our panelists, on this committee we've been debating and changing security dynamics, in particular the return of great power competition. And what do you see as being implications that we have for our military in that regard, and how do you think the events that we've seen play out over the past year may have changed your view of that discussion? Dr. Lynn, would you like to start?
Thank you. So in terms of great power competition and looking at the China dynamic, I think if I could add really quickly to what China is learning from Ukraine, I think what China is seeing is how long a war can occur. And related to the Taiwan scenario, and what the United States needs to do is we need to make sure that we are not expending all of our munitions and assets within a very short period of time. Recently, CSIS did extensive wargaming, and we found given our current stocks, they would run out within 2 weeks. And if we are expecting a Taiwan conflict to last more than that, we definitely need to build up our defense industrial base, as well as both the surge capacity as well as the capacity to be able to have more of these stocks pre-positioned in the region. In terms of great power competition, what I'm seeing from China's end, particularly after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last August, is a greater willingness on China's end to use limited demonstration of military force to express its displeasure. What is taking away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and why it thinks Russia needed to invade Ukraine, was that it saw that Russian efforts at diplomacy with our NATO allies and with the United States failed. And if you don't believe that diplomacy can allow you to achieve your aims, then you have to think about a greater use of military force, including demonstrations of force at smaller scale.
Thank you. Dr. Hill.
Thank you so much, Senator Fisher. I concur with my colleagues here on the panel, and actually I want to pick up on something that Mr. Zakheim absolutely was right in emphasizing, that in fact all of this started in 2008 with Russia's move into Georgia. In fact, we've had 15 years of this phase of great power competition, if that's how we want to call it, that we should have been paying closer attention to. We thought that was an aberration. It turned out not to be. And what we have to recognize here is obviously, we're in a very different competition, if that's what we want to call it, from Russia and China. Russia has been in the process of revanchism, revisionism, trying to overturn a territorial order in Europe. And of course, China is similarly engaged with Taiwan, is obviously of a different nature, but also territorial claims against many of its neighbors, Japan, Vietnam, and others in the South China Seas. The United States is not in that position of territorial acquisition. And again, I think part of the message that we have to get across all the time, notwithstanding all the accusations that we have from previous US actions and at different times in our history, is that we are actually trying to maintain the current international order, which means the territorial integrity of all of the recognized states, and that is different. And that should enable us to build a coalition of other countries, including middle powers, to push back against the actions of China and Russia, and specifically of Russia at this juncture, but China over the future. So I think we also have to focus on how, when we're answering these questions, we're going to work with our allies in all of these different alignments that we've already talked about, in NATO, with AUKUS, expanding that out, and also trying to push, as I mentioned before, countries like South Africa away from contemplating the kind of activities that they're now engaging in.
Thank you, sir. Senator Shaheen, please. Thank you, Senator Fisher.
Thank you, and thank you to each of you for being here today. Mr. Zakheim, I couldn't agree more about multi-year procurement. It would also help if people could count on our getting a budget done every year. That would be a good first start. So I hope all of us on this committee will take that to heart. Ms. Hill, or Dr. Hill, Belarus has seemingly been reluctant to embrace Putin's war in Ukraine, but Russia continues to use the territory in Belarus to stage its invasion. Can you briefly tell me how Putin views his relationship with Lukashenko and whether we expect Belarus to engage to a greater level in the war in Ukraine in the future?
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. It's actually very important for us to remember Belarus because it still is technically an independent country, but as you're mentioning, it's been used as a staging ground for this conflict by Ukraine by Russia. We also know, of course, that President Lukashenko of Belarus has been in some political difficulty. In the most recent elections there's a lot of questions about whether he was in fact actually elected. We had a large opposition movement that emerged, and there still continues to be questions about his long-term grip on power. What we do know, of course, is that he's become increasingly dependent for political and economic support for Russia, which is why Belarusian territory is now being used. I think Belarus was also a model for what Putin wanted to achieve in Ukraine and still remains so. We've probably forgotten that, several decades ago, Belarus and Russia entered into a union state. Nobody quite knew what that meant, but it was obviously one in which Russia dominates all of Belarus's security policy and politics and economics. And that was clearly what Putin wanted with Ukraine after the initial phases of the invasion. He wanted to do the same thing. So I think that we need to focus on Belarus in thinking forward as well.
Excuse me for interrupting, but so do we think Lukashenko is going to bow to Putin's getting the country further engaged in the war in Ukraine?
I think he has limits to what he can actually do. He's dependent on Putin for propping him up on the one hand, but on the other, he has such a level of opposition. We're seeing Belarusians fighting for the Ukrainians. We've, of course, got a lot of Belarusian opposition in the Baltic states and in Poland and elsewhere. I think Lukashenko knows that if he used the country or let the country be used as a platform for yet another set of invasions of Ukraine and actually then committed Belarusian forces, that he would face severe problems at home. I think all the signs are that he's trying to shift his way towards the exits. I mean, he's been flashing sort of signals behind the scenes that he would like to do something different. The challenge is trying to figure out how to facilitate that under the current circumstances.
Thank you. Given the turmoil in the world right now, are there opportunities that we should be trying to take advantage of? Obviously, in Syria, for example, the devastation of the earthquake has finally allowed or forced Assad to open up some more avenues into the country for humanitarian aid. You talked, I think, Dr. Lynn and Dr. Hill, each of you talked a little bit about the opportunities with some of our Asian partners to get closer together to address China. But are there other opportunities that we ought to be looking at in this turmoil and trying to take advantage of?
I'll just say very quickly, in addition to those that you've outlined, because I think those are genuine opportunities, that we should also take a much harder look at all of the web of our relationships in the Western Hemisphere, for example. One of the issues that we discovered under the last administration when we had the crisis in Venezuela was that regional countries were not well disposed towards the United States, in part because we failed to have a coherent policy towards our neighbors in Latin and South America. We've focused on problems rather than how we can build those relationships up. And I think with the shift to President Lula in Brazil, this provides more of an opportunity because he's traditionally been much more interested in international affairs. We also have opportunities in Mexico and in other countries to try to work with them looking forward. Our big problem is that 87 countries around the world, including many of our neighbors in Latin and South America, still tend to have visa-free regimes with Russia. They're looking towards Russia and China for investment and sometimes assistance. We could work on that front as well.
Thank you, Mr.
Senator,
Zakheim.
I just would add that, and I know you do a lot of work on this, allies. I mean, there's no better way to engage allies and allies more willing to work with us than when you have revanchist powers invading other countries. And they're playing out in terms of what the CCP is doing, and certainly with Russia, you see Finland and Sweden, and then, of course, as was mentioned, what the opportunities we have in the Indo-Pacific. I would add that we need to give these more meat. The AUKUS framework is a great example, but other types of particularly industrial cooperation, how we deal with supply chain challenges in terms of how it impacts the military, we're not making these alliances and relationships meaningful enough for the current security environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to visit with us today. My question will focus specifically on NATO and our obligations under Article 5 and the impact that we could see should we have to respond. Assuming the possibility exists that a belligerent Putin attack or at least his interest in perhaps expanding out of Ukraine and into one of our other allied countries that are part of NATO, what would be the probability, in your estimation, that we would also find ourselves not only legally obligated to respond in that area, but just very briefly, what do you believe the probability is of us having to also respond in short order to another conflict area regarding China? Just a probability, and I'm just going to go right in the line. Dr. Lynn?
Thank you. So I think the probability of a large-scale two simultaneous large-scale conflicts are relatively low right now, mainly because we're not seeing clear signs yet that China coordinates its plans for Taiwan on what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Because if we did see that, we would have seen significant more use of force by China against Taiwan in the past year or so.
Thank you. Dr. Hill?
And I think in addition to what Dr. Lynn has said within the NATO realm and in Europe, we're actually seeing Russia being quite cautious, notwithstanding the brutality on the ground in Ukraine. We haven't yet seen some of the things that people were worried about in terms of attacks of convoys going in to Ukraine from NATO countries. There were reports, of course, of missiles from the Black Sea going over potentially Romania and Moldova.
My question is, should we have to respond under Article 5? Assuming we had to respond under Article 5, what is the probability of having a second front open up? What would be that probability on the other side of the world?
On the other side of the world, as I think Dr. Lynn has said, I think that's quite low. And I think in Europe, what we're seeing is Russia's more likely to keep on trying with cyber, political and economic intrusions than more military expansion because of Russia's own concerns about having to respond to too many fronts at the same time.
Thank you.
If I could add really quickly, I meant to say it's low now, but that would be increasing over time.
As we get closer to perhaps a 2027 timeframe.
But also as U.S.-China competition intensifies, as China will be thinking, well, what are the best ways, if we need to use force, they will be thinking, if the United States is distracted, it is a better opportunity for us to use force.
Thank you.
Senator Rounds, I'm a little less sanguine than my colleagues here. This scenario that you've raised, the simultaneity problem, is one that our defense strategy struggles with. As you know, we shifted away from building a force that could deal with two major regional contingencies. And what that did, as you know, raised the salience of nuclear weapons, a dangerous scenario. But that's what our approach is. If we're in one fight, the way we're going to hold off the other fight, for the most part, is rely on allies and rely on our nuclear deterrent. That's a place we don't want to be. So winning in Ukraine is key here because it pins down Vladimir Putin, weakens his military, and reduces the likelihood we face the simultaneity problem which you've raised here. But I am not sanguine. I think what we saw at the Winter Olympics and this China-Russia axis presents the very problem that you're thinking about.
Following up on that, should we find ourselves in that type of a position and we would be required to, I've always said that look, nobody wants to use nuclear weapons, but the best way not to have to use nuclear weapons is to be just overwhelming in our capabilities. We're currently in the middle of upgrading our NC3. What would be, Dr. Zakheim, what would be your opinion as to our process in the upgrading, and what should we be working on or focused on right now with regard to our nuclear capabilities on the triad?
Well, I think this committee's done a great job of modernizing the triad. Of course, it's not happening fast enough, and you know that. The committee gets the briefings on it. I thought the nuclear posture review was good. It certainly didn't change the doctrine, but we're still stuck at the strategic level. And as you know, Senator, the Chinese and the Russians are modernizing, not only at the strategic level, but also kind of at theater level, intermediate level, tactical weapons, and we're behind there. And I think what that does is introduce a possibility and leads to a form of escalation that none of us would ever want.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm up against my time limit.
Thank you very much, Senator Rounds. Senator Ronald, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank all of the panelists. Clearly, there are many demands on our resources. That is an understatement. And I would consider a foundational concern to be the need to invest in our infrastructure, which is not only a matter of geopolitical competition, but also the readiness of the forces. And as chair of the subcommittee on readiness, improving our military's readiness is a top priority. In the last year, let me give you some examples. There have been numerous issues with the military's infrastructure in Hawaii, from water main breaks to toxic chemical leaks and spills endangering our groundwater. And I know that these kinds of events are not particular to Hawaii and across the country. We need to better maintain and modernize our DoD infrastructure to take care of our people, get our systems out of maintenance on time, and be able to support national security. I'll start with Dr. Lynn. It is clear that Indo-PACOM AOR infrastructure needs to be modernized. Can you elaborate on the importance of our infrastructure for our national security, especially in the Pacific?
So our infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific, particularly the fact that we are now investing more in much more resilient and dispersed basing, is absolutely critical, particularly as we look at the range of missiles, the hundreds. I think right now, if based on what DoD released last year, the range of the missiles that China has in its vicinity is clearly around 2,000 or so. The range of missiles that China can bring to bear means that in any fight, whether it's over Taiwan, we will need to be able to disperse our assets, so we're not relying on any particular base. And in order to be able to maintain that we can function from particular airfields, we need to harden our infrastructure. We also need to work with our allies and partners to make sure that we have the capabilities to quickly repair, for example, runways and other facilities. So it's absolutely critical to the fight.
Well, we basically, from what I can see, and especially with the examples of what's happening in Hawaii, we have aging infrastructure, which we tend to ignore until something breaks, and then you have Tripler Hospital, which is the main military hospital, not have water or not have electricity. We can't have that and maintain readiness. So I hope the other two panelists agree that even as we need to pay attention to other aspects of keeping our military ready, that let's not forget that some of these foundational concerns. I want to get to, again, Dr. Lynn, a key foundation of our national defense strategy is integrated deterrence, which highlights the need to work cooperatively with our allies. And a number of you have already emphasized how important it is to strengthen our allies and partners, to strengthen our economic, cultural, and defense relationships. It's all of a piece, because we can't just focus on the mill-to-mill relationships. And we can deter aggression in the Pacific, for example, with our network of allies and partners, including increased posture forward and greater opportunities to conduct training in the region. Dr. Lynn, between the recently announced access agreements with the Philippines, the U.S. basing the historic AUKUS agreement to share nuclear propulsion information and work on emerging technologies, and the current renegotiation of the compacts of freely associated states, the administration is taking large steps forward in strengthening our relationships in the important Indo-Pacific region. What kind of message do these steps send to both China and our regional partners?
Thank you. So our efforts to strengthen relations, whether it's on the defense front or on the political front, it sends a message of reassurance to our allies and partners that are looking to us to help deter Chinese coercion and deter Chinese aggression. What I would know is China is watching these efforts very, very closely. And while it does have a deterrent effort, it is also causing China to think, well, how do we counter this? And as China looks at this, what China is looking for is what they find as the weakest link among our allies and partners. And also, they probably have in their mind thinking, well, do we also need the same sort of partnerships and alliances? And that's where, again, returning back to the China-Russia relationship, as China is watching what we're doing with our allies and partners, it must be in Beijing's thinking, well, we need to definitely have our own partnerships. And Russia is definitely one of them that China needs to keep.
So how important is our relationship with the Pacific Island nations, i.e. our compact partners?
Absolutely, Senator, absolutely important, because as you know, China is trying to increase its military presence there. And as the PLA becomes more and more active, it is now venturing much more beyond the first island chain into the second island chain. So if we are able to deny China a military base within the second island chain area, that would allow the United States to continue to flow our forces into the region much more easily than if China, for example, had a military base on the Solomon Islands. It would also make it much easier for us to support some of our key allies there, including Australia.
Dr. Hill and Mr. Zakheim, do you agree that we can do a lot more with our island nation partners, i.e. Marshall Islands, the Micronesia, Palau, and other island nations?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Reno. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zakheim, how would you assess our military recruitment with all the politics that we've added into it in the last few years?
We're below where we need to be, Senator.
Another question here on spending. 2023 Department of Defense, we spent $163 billion on procurement, $139 billion on research and development. Don't you think that's a little bit much on research and development as compared to building machines and ammunition to fight wars?
Well, Senator, I think we need to do better on procurement, as your question suggests. The R&D is critical for the military we need for tomorrow, but we also need to emphasize the transition of our current force and getting the software it needs and the AI infusion that's going to be critical to making these platforms useful in some of the scenarios we're discussing here. My own view is that the strategy is right. We should focus on today and tomorrow, and the procurement needs to go up, Senator.
Yeah, sometimes you worry about tomorrow today, tomorrow never happens. And it's dangerous, the world we live in now with all the hot spots. Also, you know, with the risk posed by our Army and Navy's efforts to divest, you know, and especially in the SSGN, we're going to do away with one a year, which carries 154 Tomahawk missiles, and we're going to transition over to a boat that carries 40 missiles. Are we gambling here on this research that we just talked about?
Yeah, again, I don't have an issue with levels of research, but I agree with you, Senator, that we're not doing enough on the procurement side to keep pace with the retirements. And you're right that the capability, both in terms of total number of boats and in terms of the tubes, in terms of what the boat could deliver, is a huge problem for us in a Taiwan scenario. And it goes to procurement, as you point out, the multi-year piece, the fact that we can't build as many as we're retiring. Ultimately, I think this is capital required for industrial capacity improvement here, Senator.
Dr. Hill, you got a comment on that?
I would just urge us to, be really still emphasizing research as well as infrastructure that Senator Hirono also mentioned. As Dr. Lynn said, our adversaries look out for the weakest links. And we can be sure that China is spending an awful lot of money right now on research and development, including, trying to get access to our own IP and our other research as well. And we can only really keep ahead. As you say, of course, there's always the risk that tomorrow never comes, but we can only ever really keep ahead of our adversaries by, being on the cutting edge. That's why America's always succeeded in the past, because we've managed to find a balance between the needs of today and, what we think is coming across the horizon tomorrow. And I think, basic infrastructure, as the Senator pointed out, is pretty critical. We've just seen, with what's happened in the earthquake in Turkey, how important roads are, port facilities, for example, and how easily they can be destroyed. We need to be looking at where all our weak links are and what we can do to shore them up.
Thank you. Just one quick question, Mr. Zakheim, on Ukraine and Russia. I've been perplexed for a year of how Putin's fought this war. He probably had some good thoughts about it. He kind of tiptoed into it. Do you think he's having second thoughts about not doing shock and awe like we did in Iraq?
I think that was the original plan, and he realized that the military he thought he had was not the one that was on the ground. And now I think the strategy has changed, as we're all reading, Senator, which is he's going to fight for as long as it takes and allow his people to be mowed down until they're able to advance inch by inch, foot by foot. And I think we, that is the side of freedom, Ukraine and its supporters, the West, the United States, need to take advantage of this opportunity by speedily getting the platforms and capabilities in there, not to allow this to become a war of attrition.
This next wave of fighting that we're getting ready to have, don't you think it's going to be more of a precision fight, ISR? We're talking about tanks and stuff. Those things aren't going to last very long if we go that direction.
Well, I think that's where the future of warfare is. We're going to see whether what you're describing is able to roll back Russian forces which are actually embedded and encamped and dug into territory, and I think that's why the Ukrainians need more of these conventional forces like tanks. I think they would also benefit from fighter aircraft as well to dislodging the Russian positions.
Because of the 500,000 troops Russia's got on the border, is that what you're saying?
And they're going to keep on pushing them in.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator King, please.
Thank you. First, I want to welcome Senator Tuberville from the end of the row. He's now no longer at the end of the Senator Tuberville, welcome to the end, from not being on the end of the row, as you have been very ably.
It got very lonely on that end,
well,
especially with this big room that we had. Thank you.
Mr. Zakheim, first I want to thank you for your organization and leadership of the Reagan Defense Forum, which is a really important part of thinking through some of these strategic questions. Here's my question. It strikes me as you look back at the Ukraine conflict that if you combine the Ukrainians' will to fight with the resources of the West and the United States, Putin really in the long run doesn't stand a chance. It strikes me that Putin's best hope now is dividing the West and dividing the United States. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
I absolutely think that's part of the Putin strategy. I think he also questions the will of the West to continue to support Ukraine for the long haul.
That's what I mean.
Absolutely, yes. I agree with that.
He wants to divide us, get us tired of the conflict, and then he's just going to win through the passage of time.
I think that's his approach, Senator. I agree.
And you mentioned, you used the word a few minutes ago, speedily. And one of my concerns is that, for example, with the tanks, our response has been slow, and then we have to go through training. And I'm worried right now at this moment that the Russians are preparing for a major offensive in the east that the Ukrainians aren't going to be ready for because they don't have the equipment. In other words, we've telegraphed to them that we don't have the tanks there yet, and they're going to try to take advantage of this gap. Is that something of concern?
Yes, Senator. I think the unclassified information I've reviewed certainly suggests that. And the way I think about it, Senator, is the strategy here is to help Ukraine realize a counteroffensive, to break through that Russian line that is emerging in the Donbass. To do that, we should give them all the capabilities necessary. Tanks is one example. Fourth-generation fighter aircraft is another. And we tend to think about the platform and get stuck rather than thinking about the strategy. If we trust Ukraine to restore its sovereign territory, then we should trust them with the platforms to do that and not worry they're going to use the platform for some other purpose or escalate the battle beyond the territory of Ukraine.
Have the Ukrainians been respectful of those limitations in terms of escalating the battle into Russia?
Best and I can tell, yes. There have been some debates, I believe, on the margins, but it's always been focused on within the sovereign territory of Ukraine.
Dr. Hill, I know you touched on this. It worries me, looking at a map yesterday, the Belarus border is about 60 miles from Kyiv. If I were Putin, I'd be very tempted to try to have another offensive toward Kyiv and the decapitation of the government. I take it you believe that Belarusian politics and the regional balance does not raise the level of risk of that happening.
Well, look, I think the risk is always there because, of course, Belarus and its President Lukashenko are very much dependent on Russia at this particular point. And, of course, there's an awful lot of troops there. But I think that the pressures inside Belarus, political pressures, would make it very difficult for Lukashenko to contemplate this. This would also be a huge alarm bell for all of the other former Soviet republics. I mean, if Belarus has been actually deployed in this war, I think we're going to see a pretty aggressive response from others as well.
And based upon the intelligence that we saw a year ago, we would know if the Russians were moving significant forces in that direction.
Yeah, we've seen build-up, getting back to what Senator Tuberville was talking about before, about the placement of men and equipment there. Looks like some of them are being trained. But we haven't seen, particularly at the moment, that we're expecting waves of people going over the Belarusian border, but we mustn't rule it out.
And in fact, that ties part of the strategy probably of those deployments is to tie the Ukrainians down to some extent, defending that border rather than putting all their forces in the east and the south. Absolutely, and Putin is at pains all the time to still raise the threat to Kyiv itself of another assault. And I think, getting back to what Mr. Zakheim said before about not being sanguine about anything, actually, we have to be continuously vigilant and, continue to look at the intelligence about any of these contingencies. Dr. Lynn, final question. The key to the success thus far of the Ukrainians has been their amazing courage and will to fight. What do you assess how do you assess the will to fight of the people of Taiwan and their leadership? Is their leadership of the Churchillian quality of Zelensky, or are they closer to, let's say, Ghani?
That's an excellent question, Senator. I think Taiwan is strengthening its will to fight. It's very encouraging for Taiwan to look at what Ukraine has accomplished, and it's instilling more confidence in the Taiwan people. I would also note that unlike Ukraine, where folks could leave via land, Taiwan is surrounded by water. So even if we're not necessarily seeing the strong will now, when push comes to shove, I think many people in Taiwan will find they have no escape routes and they need to fight for their home.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Scott, please.
Great, thanks. I want to thank each of you for being here. I come from Florida. We've got 21 bases and 3 unified commands. Military is a pretty big deal, especially in our panhandle, but all across our state. So you look at the Chinese spy balloon, you look at them building military to defeat us. You'd think that American citizens would start waking up and saying, we ought to stop buying things from Communist China, because it seems like they're taking the money they make to go eventually defeat us is what their goal. So I guess the first thing is, do you think Americans ought to stop buying things made in Communist China? Because it ultimately flows to the Chinese Communist Party, and it can hurt us? I mean, what do y'all think?
Sure. So I think we definitely the U.S. government is already imposing significant restrictions on export of technology that could be used, as far as we know, to fuel military-civil fusion in China, as well as the PLA. With respect to technology below that, I think there is still a lot of advantage that Americans actually get from the cheaper products from China.
But doesn't China get a benefit?
For some of the more cheaper products, not as much, but definitely on the higher end, China is benefiting more. So we need to disaggregate where we want to limit our exports to China and where exports to China or buying from China can actually benefit U.S. consumers and U.S. citizens.
Senator, I might add to that. I agree with the way Dr. Lynn framed it. It's the strategic decoupling that's key. We have failed, and as you know, and you've led on this in the Senate, to make sure that we are not giving China the types of capabilities through our commerce that enhance the tip of the spear for part of their military. But we also have an interest in making China dependent on older technologies. And the scale of our exports to China in some ways could benefit us, but certainly on the military side, those elements, and I think we're seeing some good things out of the Bureau of Industry and Security and Commerce that are starting to put up walls, but it's taken way too long.
Do you think that China thinks we're getting weaker or stronger in relative to them? How do you think their leadership thinks?
What I've read and the way that they're planning is that they think they can beat us, particularly in the Taiwan scenario.
Right. What about, you read all this and what you hear is that how much time we're putting on having a woke military. It seems to me, I've always thought we ought to have, I served in the Navy, I thought our job was to be a lethal military, that people are scared to death of us. So do you think that, what do you think the government of Communist China thinks when they read that we're focused on pronouns and things like that, rather than how we have the most lethal military force?
Senator, I think the defense strategy is clear on this, and it started with Secretary Mattis. We need to be focused on being the most lethal force, as you point out, focusing on the core mission. Anybody in the U.S. military wants to focus on their mission. We've done polling at the Reagan Institute with our Reagan National Defense Survey. Politicization is a problem. The American people have reduced trust and confidence in the military because they believe the military is politicized. And the more we can do to allow our military, our men and women in uniform, to focus on warfighting, the better it will be for our military and the more it will deter China.
I'd like to make a comment that, look, I'm afraid that the more that we have partisan and political fights, the more our adversaries think that we're weak. I've made that point many times in public before. They watch all of this, and frankly, they think we've lost it. So the more I'm afraid that we make statements like this, the more that we start attacking our fellow Americans for whatever perspective we think they come from, the more that Russia and China think that we're working ourselves out of history. They watch all of this very carefully, but not in the ways that you think. I think China and Russia do know we still can be lethal, but we're most lethal when we get our act together and that we're all Americans fighting together on one side. And that's what our adversaries and our friends are looking to us. They would like us to get over all of these fights that we're having internally. And so, I would just urge us to, I don't honestly know what that label means. I try not to use labels. I think the more that we can stand up and just show that we're Americans in solidarity, the more we will be able to have a deterrent effect on our adversaries, and the more we'll bring our friends behind us, because they're watching us and thinking, you know, has America lost the plot at this moment?
So we stopped the vaccine mandate just recently in December. One of the issues I think a lot of us have been focused on is how do we reinstate people that were discharged, and how do we make sure they're not put in an adverse monetary position. We have a problem with the retention. We have a problem with recruitment. So how much do you think it would be important that we let people come back in that for religious or health reasons decide not to take the vaccine, or and also make sure that they don't have to pay back, back pay, they don't have to pay for training, things like that?
Readiness is key here. We, as you know, we're not meeting our numbers, and so I believe this Congress has given authority to the Secretary of Defense and Department of Defense to do just that, and it's about execution now at the State Center. Scott?
And if I could add, one major advantage that our military has over the PLA is the quality of our personnel. If you look at what President Xi Jinping has mentioned in terms of priorities for the PLA, after military theory and organization, the second priority is development of the PLA personnel, and equipment comes after that.
Yep. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott. And for the information of my colleagues, there are 2 votes beginning at 11:30. Senator Manchin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. I'm so sorry. I had another meeting I had to speak at, and I'm sure you probably covered this in generality, but I'd like to ask the questions again. First of all, I think what I'm hearing loud and clear is if we have laundry that is dirty and need washed, don't do it in the public when the military is involved. I'm hearing that loud and clear, which probably every time we have military conversations or disagreement, it should be done in a skiff with all 100 of us there so we can talk about it to each other and how we come out of there unified. So that's a clear message you're giving us, and you ought to continue to give that. I feel very strongly about that. Next of all, I'd like, Dr. Lynn, I'll start with you. First of all, does the Taiwanese have the ability to defend themselves against mainland China, to be independent? And if not, would they have the ability with the United States' help? And if it took the United States' help, would we have any allies coming with us to defend Taiwan the way that they have come together in Europe on Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So to be frank, Taiwan would not be able to stand by itself.
It cannot defend itself,
No.
no matter what we do, no matter what equipment we give them.
When you're talking about a large-scale invasion,
Yeah.
given the vast power disparities that China can bring to bear, Taiwan would not be able to stand alone.
Okay.
Yes.
Can they do it with our help? Are we able to deter that, or just basically prolong it?
Yes, so I think that is what the department is focused on with Taiwan as the pacing scenario, to make sure that the United States can be able to flow enough assets and have the right both posture, capabilities, as well as operational
I'm
competence.
understanding there's a little bit of a difference of what we believe that they would need to defend themselves and be successful versus what they desire to have.
So when Taiwan thinks about its defense needs, it's thinking not only about the high-end contingency of the Chinese invasion, it's also thinking about the day-to-day gray zone incursions that China is flying into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So from their perspective, they need to cover all the different threats.
Okay. And how about allies? Which allies would come to the defense that look at Taiwan and the commitment other than the U.S.? I have not heard of other allies believing that it's of national interest to them to go and fight or support a Taiwanese war against China.
So we are increasingly hearing from Japan that the defense of Taiwan is also vital to Japanese national security, and that's why the critical national security documents, the new documents that came out in December from Japan's end, reflect the seriousness that Japan takes for this problem.
How about South Korea?
I would put South Korea lower than potentially Australia and other. So Japan, I would put
Japan the highest.
Australia. South Korea would be a bit lower than that.
Okay.
And the Philippines would probably be somewhere between Australia and South Korea.
And we're putting much effort in the Philippines right now trying to build that up. Okay. And Dr. Hill, Ukraine. Does Ukraine have the ability to fight and win the war to take back the Donbass and also Crimea?
Well, it's not just Donbass and Crimea, it's also these other two
Yeah,
regions as well of Kherson and Zaporizhia.
I mean, basically putting their country back.
It very much, as we've been talking before, depends on the provision of military assistance from the United States and other allies, and also a diplomatic effort too. I mean, I think you're just primarily on the battlefield, it's going to be extraordinarily difficult because, we've already had a discussion about how much the Russians have dug in at this particular point. So we need to have diplomacy pushing alongside the military. I can't honestly say about whether it's feasible for Ukraine. There's differences of opinion in the United States, UK, and among other European allies.
Are you all gauging the support of the Russian citizens towards this fight? That they believe it's an honorable fight, it's a needed fight, it's one that they have to put their country and take back?
This is being put to the test. What Putin's trying to tell the Russians at the moment is this is the third patriotic war after Napoleon's invasion, Nazis' invasion. I mean, this is ridiculous of Russia, the Soviet Union, in the Second World War. Now this is the next invasion.
Really?
I don't think all Russians are buying this. We've seen 1 million people leave, and I'm not convinced myself that another additional 500,000 people are willing to be sacrificed on the front lines of what is, to some extent, a vanity project for Vladimir Putin.
And you think the Ukrainians have the willpower and the people power to continue this
They
fight?
certainly have the willpower. The people power is under some stress at the moment because of the sheer numbers that Russia is trying to push to the battlefield. We're aware of that, which is why, as Mr. Zakheim has been saying, it's very important to outweigh that with equipment. But again, diplomatic support is going to be crucial. It won't be just one on the battlefield, this war for Ukraine.
Yeah, but diplomatic, I'm always concerned that the United States might intervene or the Europeans put so much pressure on to go to the negotiating table, and Putin's going to walk away with a win. No matter if he loses, he'll walk away with a propaganda win.
I have exactly the same concerns, which is why we have to really step up our diplomacy with other countries to make very clear how unacceptable it is to have Putin get away with what is a violation
My final
of
part,
international
is I'm running
law.
out of time, I know. I'm so sorry, if I may, sir. Basically, the will for our allies to stay into this fight, are they going to be forced back as energy independence or energy security or a lack of it or a need of the Russian energy, cheap energy they've had before? Is that going to force maybe this to a table or to a resolve prior to where it needs to be?
This is much less of a factor than it was before. I think actually you'll find that Europeans' resolve is much stronger than perhaps is often seen from here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Mullen, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And just for comment purposes, I want to say if there's any way I could get a list of promotions before we vote on them, because I think I just voted on my brother-in-law to be promoted, and I want the ability to maybe put a hold on him before I do that. I like him sometimes, but not always.
Absolutely. You have to go through 1,700 names.
That's fine. I'll find him pretty quick.
No, that's no problem.
Anyways, I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee, and I want to go straight to, and sir, forgive me if I mess your name, but Zakheim?
Zakheim, but I'll take Zakheim.
Would say that again?
Zakheim.
Zakheim. All right, Zakheim. In 2022, the National Defense Strategy Briefing mentioned our enemy's use of irregular warfare as a way to destabilize our allies and undermine our conventional military power. Can you speak of the effects of Russia's energy warfare that's had on Europe's resolve and the allies in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and I want to associate myself with what Dr. Hill just said, where they absolutely tried to intimidate and browbeat the Europeans into submission on the basis of turning off the spigots, and energy warfare is really what it came down to. And I think in this regard, Europe, I guess from my standpoint, surprised me. They've diversified, and as recently as you may be aware, Senator, Vladimir Putin is now going to reduce production because he hasn't seen the effects of this form of warfare. So I think it's actually been a good news story to date.
Well, I've said this multiple times that U.S. energy independence brings on global stabilization. People want to do business with the United States. And Dr. Hill, you made a reference that we should be trying to help our allies more with food, fuel, and fertilizer. The problem is that underneath this current administration, the war on energy, even the president's comments just recently that he's wanting to eliminate fossil fuels within 10 years, it causes problems with our allies. Would you agree?
Well, it depends on how we're framing all of that. I mean,
well, if we cut fossil fuels, you're going to damage food supply. As a rancher, someone that produces a lot of protein for the American people, I can't run my tractors and our semis on electricity. Yeah. And if I could, it would cost 2 or 3 more times to buy that product, which there's not the margin in there. So it's going to hurt the food supply. Fertilizer, my Lord,
Yeah.
we saw the effects of that last year.
Yeah.
So when you make that comment, it would have to. It would have to have reverse effects on our allies, wouldn't it? Because they'd have to depend on somebody else for that.
Well, look, you're absolutely right in making this distinction, and I'm glad you did, because, of course, 70% of food production is fuel, just as you've pointed out, and it's not electricity, it's actually the fuel that's in the major equipment, but it's also for making fertilizer, because all the ammonia phosphates and, fertilizers are used with natural gas. So we have to, what I was going to say is we have to have a very sensible discussion about all of this. There's another dimension beyond the fuel, fertilizer, food mix, which you've quite rightly pointed out, which is of nuclear energy too.
Absolutely.
We haven't put this in the mix. And Vladimir Putin has, of course, imperiled civilian nuclear power by attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, going through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. We've been dependent on Russia for some of the fuel supply system for nuclear fuel. This is a time for us to step up into this realm as well. I think, possibly for this committee and many others, we should be having a very sensible, open discussion on the complexities of this issue and how to balance it off.
Thank you, I agree. Sir, what lessons should we learn from Russia's irregular warfares?
Well, I mean, they've been effective with hybrid warfare, as you note, in Georgia, in Crimea. In this case, Putin was perhaps overconfident in his conventional forces capability and didn't pursue that route, although I would note that the day before Russia had the physical land invasion of Ukraine, there were robust cyber attacks on Ukraine, on their government servers, and actually globally. And so we have to think of this conflict as one that's playing out in all domains, including, I think, what you're characterizing as the irregular domain as well. And the notion that we're in some sort of steady state, either peace or conflict, the reality is that there are elements of our of military domains right now that are an active conflict, cyber being the primary example.
Thank you. And, sir, with the fact that I came over from the House and we respect the time because we get cut off, I'm going to yield back the remainder of my time to you.
Thank you. That is an example that everyone should follow.
I agree.
I thank Senator Mullen. You've added so much to the committee already.
You'll get over it soon.
With that, let me recognize for 5 minutes Senator Blumenthal. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to use any of my 5 minutes to comment on in reaction. Thank you all for being here. This has been very, very helpful and enlightening. I've been to Kyiv 3 times in the past year, and every time I go, I am so deeply moved and impressed by the resolve and resilience of the Ukrainian people, which I think, in the end of the day, is the reason that they will win. Because, as President Zelensky told me during one of my visits with him, they'll fight to the last person, and they will fight with pitchforks if they need to do it. And I have supported his requests for the javelins and stingers, and then for long-range artillery and still longer-range artillery, the ATACMS, not just the HIMARS, for the tanks that he needs, not just the Bradley and Stryker vehicles, but the Leopards and the Challengers, and now for the fighter aircraft. But as important as those munitions and artillery and other hardware are, I think the morale and determination of the people of Ukraine is equally important. And in that connection, I have worked with Senator Graham to support designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Every time I've met with President Zelensky, he has mentioned it. In fact, when we brought to him a copy of the resolution passed unanimously by the United States Senate asking the administration to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, his face alighted. We presented him to with the resolution in July, Senator Graham and I. It has meaning to the people of Ukraine. Would you agree with me that Russia should be designated a state sponsor of terrorism?
I would actually have to say with regret that I would not. And let me just elaborate why. Because I think that what we really need to do is to be able to persuade other countries in the global south and elsewhere that it's very important for them to support Ukraine and to push back against Russian aggression there. And we have to focus this on what Russia has done to violate Ukraine's territorial integrity. I think once you put it into that designation, you then start to have a lot of countries pull back from any support that they might have given, because the consequences of that will be them questioning whether that's going to happen to them as well. We have many other conflicts around the world. We have Saudi Arabia's attacks on Yemen, for example, and many others where I would hesitate to think that we would apply that designation. What we have to do when we look at this is to see where we can actually use the precedent of whatever action we take. There's one other element that I do want to point out, though, that we should be making very clear that the United States, along with the United Kingdom, have a special role in supporting Ukraine because of the agreements that we had in 1994 to support Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence when we pushed them to give up nuclear weapons. One thing we haven't mentioned on this panel is the proliferation challenge that we now face because of this. So I do think that we, the United States, along with the United Kingdom and others, should be stressing continuously how important it is to support Ukraine. But I'm afraid that with regret, I would hesitate taking this step.
How about the Wagner Group? Would you agree with me that we should designate the Wagner Group as a foreign terrorist organization?
I think that would fall into that category. I think with the Wagner Group and other paramilitary formations, we definitely can discuss this. I mean, the atrocious acts that they're undertaking. They've actually attacked special forces of the United States in Deir ez-Zor in Syria in 2018.
So you would distinguish?
I would distinguish Wagner. It's the actions of particular groups under that state rubric.
Let me ask you, over the course of this year, the prospect of potential escalation by Putin has been raised as a reason not to provide each of these weapons platforms as we've gone along. And I've said the danger of escalation has been vastly overestimated. Just as we've underestimated the capability of the Ukrainian forces, we've overestimated or exaggerated Putin's potential for escalating. Could you give me your thoughts about whether we are close to that escalation point, whether it would be triggered by the fourth-generation fighter aircraft that now we're urging be provided?
I want to cede some of this to Dr. Zakheim, but I just want to make it very clear. Putin escalates all the time. Sending 500,000 extra people, 300,000 extra people to the front is an escalation. We are seeing a lot of caution, as we mentioned earlier, about crossing over into NATO territory because he doesn't want to have a full-on kinetic war with NATO. But I don't think that actually specific choices of equipment really germane to this debate.
I agree with Dr. Hill, and I think the point here is, what is the platform going to be used for? Why is it necessary? That is the question that should animate decision-making, with the emphasis on urgency and speed. And I agree with you, Senator. I think fighter aircraft, ones that this Congress has authorized the U.S. military not to use anymore, that could easily be sent over there, could have a material impact on the fight within the sovereign territory of Ukraine.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cotton, please.
I agree with what Senator Blumenthal said, that the administration has been deterring itself from providing the Ukrainians the weapons they need. I'd say from the very beginning, they've engaged in half measures while Ukraine has half succeeded, and they should quit pussyfooting around on the battlefield. I want to look before Russians launched this war, though, Mr. Zakheim, to what happened in 2021. Winston Churchill, in his famous Iron Curtain speech, cautioned against offering temptations to a trial of strength. And he offered that caution specifically about the Russians, who he had said he had just seen up close and personal as allies and friends for many years. And there's nothing they respect so much as military strength, and nothing for which they have less respect than military weakness. Can you tell us, how did the botched withdrawal in Afghanistan perhaps tempt Vladimir Putin to a trial of strength in Ukraine?
Well, I think they correlate, Senator. I agree with your, the thrust of your question. The United States looked weak. Didn't look like it was did not support and stayed until every U.S. service member went home, and it looked like we were unable to carry out military operations, and so we looked defeated. And I think when you look weak, people like Vladimir Putin seek to exploit the opportunity.
When Joe Biden took office, I think it'd be fair to say that Vladimir Putin's top two foreign policy priorities, at least as it related to the United States, were one, the extension of the New START treaty, which is a badly one-sided nuclear arms control treaty that the Obama administration entered, and two, the waiver of sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. In his very first week in office, Joe Biden extended the New START treaty. Shortly after that, he waived sanctions on Nord Stream 2 pipeline. How did Joe Biden's decision to give Vladimir Putin his top two foreign policy priorities without any concessions whatsoever perhaps tempt Vladimir Putin into a trial of strength in Ukraine?
Well, it made clear to everybody, including, I think, President Biden, that engagement with Vladimir Putin, that seeking to put forward a carrot in order to prevent the type of behavior that we've seen consistently from Vladimir Putin, as we mentioned before, from 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea, is not going to work. That, as you pointed out at the beginning of your question here, Senator Cotton, President Putin responds to one thing: force in kind and strength. And I think that is what the Ukrainians have shown, and this Congress has supported and actually pushed the president to be more forceful in that support and to understand the urgency that's required there.
Let's look at the provision of weapons to Ukraine. Actually, let's go back to the Obama-Biden era, since in President Obama's era, we provided meals ready to eat and blankets, not ammunition and javelins. And then since then, it's been a constant story of ammunition but not artillery, artillery but not HIMARS, HIMARS but not armor, infantry fighting vehicles but not tanks. Okay, tanks but not fighters or ATACMs or cluster munitions or so forth. I have to assume, given this pattern, we're going to see provision of some of those weapons and platforms sometimes in the future when they're less effective than they would have been if they had been provided months ago or at the beginning of this war. But let's look at one in particular. Since a lot of these things we're talking about, Bradley fighting vehicles, especially Abrams tanks, F-16s, do have long logistic tails and take some training. We've heard a lot today about Russians being dug in trench lines, almost World War I style warfare. We have more than 1 million cluster munitions in our stockpiles here in the United States. To date, we are not providing them in anything like sizable numbers. Could you explain what cluster munitions could do to help the Ukrainians perhaps break through the stalemate in eastern Ukraine?
Well, Senator, as you point out, they disperse, they clear the field, and they're very effective in having a strategic impact when you're dealing with the tactical problem that you've outlined.
And why would we not provide cluster munitions, which would be ready to fire in a matter of days, unlike, say, an Abrams tank or an F-16?
Well, I think anything that we have in our inventory that would be useful for this battle, we ought to offer the Ukrainians.
Okay. One final question for you, Mr. Zakheim. This is in your role at the Ronald Reagan Institute. Y'all do an annual poll about the American people's respect and admiration for our military. It's shown alarming downward trends in recent years. Can you give us some thoughts, both from the poll and from your experience in crafting these questions and following them over the years, about why that is the case?
Senator, thank you for that. We do the Reagan National Defense Survey annually, and just 4 years ago, the American people's trust and confidence in the military was over 70%. And as you referenced there, Senator, now it's actually below 50%. In the most recent defense survey, we asked the respondents why, and the response was clear that the American people believe that the military has become politicized. That's expressed in a variety of different ways, from civilian leadership politicizing the military, to military leadership politicizing the military, to concerns about wokeism and extremism, and it divides up differently across percentage lines. But I think it is not a concern on the American people that the U.S. military is unable to carry out their core mission of protecting this country and being the best military force in the world. It's a concern about politicization penetrating their mission, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses. If I had 10 minutes of questioning, I'd spend 5 comparing a Biden administration that has assembled a global coalition to stand for democracy against an illegal invasion, and a previous administration that illegally withheld congressionally mandated arms sales to Ukraine to extort a political advantage by doing so. But I have 4 minutes and 39 seconds. And so I'm going to take 2 minutes, Dr. Lynn, with you on a question about China and diplomacy, and then 2 minutes with Dr. Hill and Mr. Zakheim about an allies reference, picking up on some of your verbal testimony. Dr. Lynn, in the events surrounding this spying balloon incident, the thing that has troubled me the most is not the capacity of a high-altitude balloon. I've probably been troubled most by General Austin trying to call his counterpart in China and no one picking up the phone. What does it say about the diplomatic relationship as an expert that that's happening, and what do we need to do so that we have, at a minimum, clear channels of communication to avoid unnecessary escalations?
Senator Kane, that's an excellent question. I'm not surprised that Secretary Austin's counterpart did not pick up the phone. We have a track record of us reaching out to the PLA and them not picking up the phone or responding at a much later time where it's no longer relevant to the situation that we are trying to deal with. It shows that across the U.S. engagement with China, our military-to-military ties and relationship is relatively weak. And despite the efforts of this administration to focus on deconflictions, crisis communications with the PLA, we have not made significant progress. And I wouldn't fault that to be on the U.S. side. I would fault that to be the Chinese. From their perspective, they have very little incentives to communicate or deconflict from us because they view our attempts to communicate with them as either allowing or greenlight certain types of U.S. operations.
Don't they, though, value stability, and they wouldn't like surprises or accidents or miscalculations that weren't in their sort of intentional interest?
They do value that, but we have seen since 2021 that they've canceled the military maritime consultative agreement, the key military-to-military dialogues to prevent unsafe encounters and whatnot. I think from the Chinese perspective, they believe that if they can reach an agreement with the United States at the highest strategic level on how the relationship should be framed, all the other elements should fall in line, which is why, from their perspective, they're very intent on constructing this framework of U.S.-China relations, which, from the U.S. perspective, that's only one piece of the relationship.
Right. Thank you. To Dr. Hill and Mr. Zakheim. Dr. Hill, you said something about I think it was in reference to American allies in the hemisphere that we pay attention to problems rather than build relationships. And Mr. Zakheim, you said we need to always focus on allies as one of the most important strengths we have against any adversary. The network of allies we have is important. I'm the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I see this throughout the Americas, deep Chinese involvement economically, humanitarian aid, debt deals that'll get you in trouble later, but they might be attractive up front. And what our allies tend to say to us is, we'd rather deal with you. I mean, we're culturally more connected. We're suspicious of some of the Chinese offers that are on the table. But if they've got an offer and you've got nothing, how do we say to our people, well, we're turning down the free 5G system or the port infrastructure bill? So talk a little bit about, particularly in the Americas, your thoughts about the way to turn episodic attention to problems into a more sustained effort to build relationships.
I think this is absolutely spot on, and we need a strategy because China has a strategy, and maybe they come in, as you say, in very specific ways with the Belt and Road Initiative, investments in energy in places like Venezuela, for example, coming in with other forms of assistance, targeting elites. We know that the Chinese are extraordinarily very good at honing in on elites and propping them up. Russia does exactly the same. And it's part of this top-down approach that Dr. Lynn has described. They look for a framework of the relations. They start at the top, and then they let everything else flow from there. And that's not the way that we approach our allies and partners in any hemisphere, let alone in the Western Hemisphere. And when I was in the previous administration, I worried a great deal as a result of the crisis in Venezuela that we didn't have a plan, that we didn't have deep relationships. We took a lot of the neighboring countries for granted, and we didn't have deep relationships.
Could I let Mr. Zakheim, we've identified the problem, and he'll give us the solution.
Oh. No pressure there, Senator. I do think the answer here is diplomacy that Dr. Hill's speaking about. Brazil was raised before, and President Biden's engagement, I think, is absolutely critical. Trade and commerce. Yeah. And this is what needs to grow. That is what we do best as a country. Unleash our free market. We've tried this and success and failed over the decades, but that continues to be worked aggressively. And I think looking at Colombia, I think there's a layer where a security relationship appropriately tailored for the country can have a positive impact in terms of the type of effects that you're talking about, Senator.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Budd, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Wicker. I'm honored to join the Armed Services Committee, and I'll certainly be a good steward of our military interests in North Carolina. And Senator Wicker, I'll work to keep your legacy alive at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Appreciate your service there. You know, it's clear that deterrence failed in Ukraine. I'm deeply concerned that the Biden administration's policies and actions will similarly lead to deterrence failing in Asia, and that China will attempt to take Taiwan by force. So, Mr. Zakheim, you were recently reappointed to the National Defense Strategy Commission. In understanding that the commission work just started on the 2022 National Defense Strategy, what does the NDS get right? And please give 2 or 3 examples of what the Biden administration got wrong.
A glaring gap in the national defense strategy of the Biden administration, but I think it was also true for the Trump administration, is that, Senator, when you look for the word resources, dollars, what's required to execute that strategy, you will not find that word. And so I think for policymakers and elected officials, your challenge is to figure out what is exactly required to realize the significant objectives of that defense strategy. And that's where I think the commission historically has been helpful, and I think we'll do so again. I think the simultaneity question that came up earlier, Senator, would be a second one I point to. It's quite different than 2017, where we didn't see as clearly and you didn't have as much evidence of this Russia-China axis. It's live, it's real, and we need to think through that. And nuclear weapons cannot be the only answer, nor can some kind of vague reference to allies. It needs to have meaning. AUKUS is a good step, but that should be one of many examples, which right now we don't have.
Thank you. Continuing on, last year you told this committee that a strategy of deterrence by denial, it's a sound approach to keep China from invading Taiwan. Do you maintain that position? And if so, what is your current assessment of our posture in the Indo-Pacific? And should we, for example, invest more heavily or move faster in specific areas?
Yeah, I do think the denial approach, deterrence by denial, is still sound, although, as mentioned earlier in this hearing, some of those key elements, particularly undersea warfare capability, fast boat submarines, are just not being produced at a clip that will realize that the deterrence by denial. I think this committee and this administration and previous administration has done a good job investing in some of the capabilities, missiles, anti-ship missiles, long-range precision munitions are key for that fight. That was less apparent, or we hadn't addressed that sufficiently the last go-around. So I think those would be the 2 areas where we need to emphasize really that are critical to accomplishing the deterrence by denial strategy. Last point on that, Senator, I would also say that we have to continue to focus on balancing, and whereas Taiwan might be the most apparent and clearest flashpoint, the Indo-Pacific has other challenges, China has other ambitions, and they are global in nature, as we see most recently in terms of China invading our airspace.
So, Mr. Zakheim, much has been made about potential timelines for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but predicting when might make war seem inevitable, an invasion seem inevitable. So what are the near and long-term risks of deterrence failing without significant and sustained growth of our defense budget?
I mean, I take the view here that this strategy, which is a bipartisan strategy between the Biden and Trump administration, wants to deter for today. It recognizes the so-called Davidson window as a real possibility, and we have to deter and operate with the urgency that it could happen today. That is the best way to push it out to tomorrow. And with tomorrow, we need to continue to make those investments where we have the modernized force that China is clearly investing in. I think one thing this committee has done well, we know about the Chinese military modernization because this committee requires an annual China military modernization report. We learn a lot and we educate the public around it. And as much as we're concerned about what China is doing with their civil fusion, just focusing on their core military modernization has revealed what a significant challenge we're facing today.
Thank you. Many Americans, some would say a majority of Americans, support Ukraine, including the reclaiming of territory taken by Russia. A growing number of Americans, however, are rightly concerned that the U.S. is providing too much aid, particularly in comparison to our European allies. So in my limited time, Dr. Hill, given that the U.S. is no longer resourced to fight 2 major wars simultaneously,
We must consider real trade-offs between continuing to arm Ukraine or being ready to deter, or if necessary, defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Where and how should the United States encourage our European allies to step up so we can free up resources to focus on the priority theater in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Senator, but I actually think that Russia and China are fused together in this regard. We all forget that Russia is actually an Asia-Pacific power. It actually has a long border with China. In fact, the longest border that Russia has in any country is with China. And Russia has benefited from China's assistance and facilitation of this war, including moving its own troops from the Russian Far East to the front in Ukraine. So China and Russia are part of the same problem, unfortunately. I do agree with you that we need to work very closely with our European allies. We also have European allies who are interested in the Asia-Pacific region. The AUKUS alignment, for example, includes the United Kingdom. We unfortunately got into a bit of a spat with France over that, but I think we can recover from this. We need to think about our other European allies that are major maritime powers, which France and the UK actually are. But I do think we need to recognise that Europeans are stepping up on the front in Ukraine. We may also have to ask Europe what it's prepared to do in the Indo-Pacific region as well, because they have interest.
Very good. Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you, Senator Butt. Senator Rosen, please.
Well, thank you, Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, for holding this very timely hearing on global security challenges, which comes ahead of unfortunately, the one-year anniversary of Vladimir Putin's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. And as Russia and Ukraine, of course, we know they're both preparing for spring counteroffensives because of the weather there. It's absolutely critical, I believe, that the United States and our allies stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes to help the Ukrainian people win. So, Dr. Hill, I want to build on a question that Senator Manchin asked you. If Ukraine were to undertake a military operation in Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014, how could the U.S. and NATO allies deter Russian escalation short of a direct military confrontation between NATO and Russia?
Well, first of all, Senator Rosen, thank you very much for this question. But there is a lot of territory between the Ukrainian front lines and Crimea at this particular point. The Ukrainians have been able to penetrate into the airspace over Crimea using drones and other long-range missiles. We've seen some of this happen. But in actual fact, what Putin is trying to do is consolidate all the territory around Crimea to keep it. So in fact, what Mr. Zakheim was already talking about, which is the military battle in Donbass region and also in Zaporizhia and Kherson, is pretty important. So we've got to look at that before Crimea comes onto the agenda. Now, there is a case, and I think that we have to be discussing this with the Ukrainians behind the scenes about what to do when it comes to the issue of Crimea over the longer term. Russia's claimed all of this territory, not just Crimea. We have to figure out how we're going to push those claims back. It's not just a question of how far we can push Ukrainian territory forward again in this battle, but what are we going to do about that territory over the longer term? The Ukrainians were willing to discuss some other formulations internationally prior to all of the atrocities that have been carried out here. And I think we have to have an international level discussion in the United Nations of how to handle this. It is unacceptable at any point for Russia to have any kind of political control and claims to sovereignty over Ukrainian territory. So it's not just a question of what happens when Ukraine tries to retake territory, but how we're going to handle this over the longer term.
Well, thank you. And I kind of want to build on that because we know that we're trying to add Finland and Sweden, their NATO ascension. It's really going to bolster our alliance, of course, in significant ways. We all know that. And so what do you think the advantages, comparative advantages, or the challenges that we might have bringing them into the alliance? Will that help us? How will that help us in some of the things that we're trying to do as well?
Well, look, Finland and Sweden have made a strategic decision to join NATO. They could have joined at any point since World War II, since the creation of NATO, and they did not. Finland has a very long border with Russia. It was attacked by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, 1940s. And Finland has actually got an incredibly important defensive posture. They can put up to 800,000 people under arms. Right. So Finland is determined to defend itself and is also making it very clear that it wants to be part of the defense of Europe. So this is very significant. Sweden was completely neutral up until this point. This is a huge rupture in the strategic posture of Sweden, and Sweden's also making it clear that it intends to defend Europe writ large too. So this puts on the agenda a whole rethinking of our European security posture. This isn't just something that the United States has to step up to. Sweden and Finland are stepping up as well.
Thank you. I want to build on that in the minute or so I have left. So, Dr. Lynn, I want to talk with you a little bit about maintaining our defense technological edge. Global competition, we have declining R&D, we have contracting challenges, we have a huge STEM workforce gap, huge. They're just a few of the impediments that we have to growing the edge with our adversaries. We see them all around. We've been talking about this today, particularly China, and that's a pacing challenge for us. So how, in your opinion, do you assess the U.S.'s ability to develop, to adopt, to deploy these emerging technologies for national security, and particularly as compared to China, which we know is really moving forward pretty quickly?
I guess I'll separate the development of technology into two aspects. One is developing of the talent, which I think China is able to do much faster because they have more of the STEM education and because they are able to redirect education in certain ways that we in the U.S. government don't have the same authoritarian powers to do. But I would say that when it actually comes to the fielding and ability to operate this emerging technology, that's where, and this goes back to our discussion earlier, the personnel and the training within the PLA is far lacking than the United States. So we can see a lot of, for example, new weapon systems online, but that doesn't mean that China is actually able to operate these new weapon systems. So I would say that I wouldn't characterize the United States as necessarily lagging behind the Chinese. I would say we have different advantages in terms of we have the personnel and we're able to incorporate the technologies, but China, on the military side, but China is able to invest more and is also able to have they have also more STEM graduates to help try to develop the technology to begin with.
So you would say going broad and deep and STEM education starting as early as possible, pre-K, all the way through to develop the pipeline would be in our critical best interest.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And unfortunately, my colleague from Virginia is not here. And had I had 10 minutes to raise an issue, I would have asked you guys. A previous Democratic administration, the Obama administration, wouldn't give the Ukrainians javelins because they were scared about sparking a war with Putin. The next administration, the Trump administration, immediately gave javelins. Previous Democratic administration, the Obama administration, declared a red line in Syria, then watched everybody walk over it, invited the Russians into the Middle East for the first time in decades. And the next administration declared a red line in Syria with Russian proxies saying if they get any closer to our special forces, we will destroy them. And then we destroyed them, hundreds of them, killed them. So there's a lot of comparisons here. I just want my colleague to know, but I don't have 10 minutes. I'm going to turn to another topic that is all about American strategy, and that's energy. I'm glad to see Senator Manchin, Senator Mullen have raised this.
You gonna go? You gonna come back?
You know, a very memorable meeting I had many years ago with our former chairman here, Senator McCain, and a Russian dissident, very brave Russian dissident who's now in jail, Vladimir Kara-Murza. I had asked him, what more can we do to undermine the Putin regime? What more can we do to go after Putin and the oligarchs? He said, it's easy, Senator. Number one thing you can do as a country is produce more American energy. Number one. Do you agree with that, Dr. Hill, Mr. Zakheim? And if you can keep your answers short, I have a bunch of questions. American energy as a really important tool of American power to deal with great powers like Russia and China.
Well, I would say yes, writ large, together with our allies and rethinking also our energy posture, so absolutely.
Yes. Thank you. Dr. Lynn, someone else who's very scared of American energy dominance is Xi Jinping. You read the reporting, it makes him very nervous. I was just in the Middle East, 60% of China's oil and gas goes through the Straits of Hormuz. If we're in a conflict with them, we could shut that down in 10 minutes. Is American energy dominance important for us? All the above, oil, gas, renewables, whatever, but certainly oil and gas. Is that important for our competition with China? And is that something we should emphasize?
Absolutely. And China imports about 70% of its oil, so it is a huge dependency that China needs to work around.
And so they're scared when they look at American energy dominance. Is that correct?
Yes.
Let me ask another question. We haven't done American energy dominance. We haven't produced more American energy. To the contrary, when this administration came into office, they did three things. They immediately started shutting down the production of American energy. They immediately started shutting down American energy infrastructure. They immediately started pressuring American financial institutions not to invest in American energy. And then when the prices of energy went up on working families, they went overseas. President bended knee to the king of Saudi Arabia, begging for more oil, lifting sanctions on Venezuela, a terrorist regime, to get more oil, and they make it harder to produce American energy here. Let me ask you this question. Assume that there was a project in America, $9 billion investment, 200,000 barrels a day, 2,500 jobs to build it, 75% of which are union, lowest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, highest environmental standards in the world of any energy project. From a national security perspective, if that was in front of you right now, would you say approve it, or would you say, no, keep begging from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela? What would you do, Dr. Lynn? Would you approve a project like that?
I would approve it, but I would also continue to strengthen our relations with Saudi and many of our
I agree,
friends and
I agree,
partners.
100%. But not Venezuela, right?
No, not Venezuela.
Yeah, you don't need to go begging from them. Dr. Hill, would you approve a project like that? From a national security perspective, that's all
From
I'm
a
asking.
national security perspective, absolutely, but we also need to look at the domestic versus the export potential.
Correct.
Because I think, what we've got, what we're talking about here is how much energy that the United States can also export.
Yeah,
and our own,
100%. But
domestic
200,000 barrels a
independence.
day, that gives us muscle, right? From
Certainly-
America.
Certainly
American
in
work.
the short to medium term, it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Zakheim, what about you?
I agree.
Okay, thank you. Now, final question. Assume we had a senior administration official who goes to Asia, who cautions our allies in Asia not to purchase clean-burning American LNG, and then tells these same Asian allies, don't help some of the other countries, ASEAN countries, for example, transition from coal to gas, make them transition from coal to wind turbines. Would that be smart American foreign policy, diplomatic policy as it relates to Asia and building our alliances? Does that make sense to any of you?
There is one element, and I.
Well, just
my
real quick,
colleagues have
I'm
said-
out of time, but
No, but the point is that China is making huge inroads on renewables and on green energy, including on constructing turbines. So it wouldn't necessarily be a wrong thing to do if we can also have the technology, as Dr. Lynn has said.
China's building a coal plant a week, and in ASEAN, they want to build more coal plants. We have I'm naming John Kerry, if you haven't noticed. Does that make sense for John Kerry to go to Asia and warn our allies not to buy American LNG and tell the ASEAN countries you can't go from coal to gas, you got to go from coal to windmill, which no industrialized country has ever done? Dr. Lim, does that make any sense?
So I think one of the concerns that countries, particularly in ASEAN, but also in the Pacific Island, have is about climate change and how that affects their national security. So what I don't know is what Secretary Kerry was thinking behind that. But I think from a U.S. perspective, it makes sense to encourage our allies and partners to buy American.
To buy American LNG. Dr. Zakheim.
I associate with Dr. Lynn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. I'm going to recognize Senator Duckworth and ask Senator Warren to take over as I go vote. I shall return. Someone said that once. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the panel. I want to pick up on a thread from earlier in the conversation and discuss why I find the CCP's actions across the Indo-Pacific, from the Mekong River to the South China Sea to the Pacific Island nations, so incredibly troubling. It's no secret that the CCP is using economic coercion and expanding its diplomatic presence in this key area of the world. And reality dictates that countries in this region cannot simply ignore China's presence and proximity. And yet I still hear from our allies and partners about how the United States remains a strong partner of choice and even those who are not yet allies and partners. I sat down and had a meeting with the Prime Minister of Cambodia, and he said he wanted to engage with the United States as a partner when it comes economic engagement. Which brings me to my first question. Dr. Lynn, it's lovely to see you again, and I appreciated your insights when I was preparing for my travel to Taiwan last year, and I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts as I plan another trip to the region. Your testimony highlighted how our nation's alliances and partnerships are a critical advantage over the PRC, and I couldn't agree more, and that's why I'm leading a CODEL next week to Indonesia and Japan to discuss a wide range of issues, including energy security and the role that biofuels can play in reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, facilitating greater economic engagement among friendly nations or those who would like to become more friendly, and the importance of expanding people-to-people academic exchanges, including those that have brought many Indonesians to study in Illinois. I will also engage both countries on bolstering multilateral organizations like ASEAN. Dr. Lynn, how do you see the role of multilateral partnerships and agreements in countering malign CCP activity, and how can the United States best show support for all of our Southeast Asian partners with our relationships with them, but also encouraging other partners like Taiwan to engage with our Southeast Asian partners? Thank you.
Senator Duckworth, great to see you too. And I'm really heartened that you're taking another trip to the region, because part of what we need to do from the United States, not only the Biden administration, but also throughout Congress, is to have more visits to the region. Our own presence there to the region reassures our allies and partners, and also showcases that we care and are listening to what they're most concerned with. With respect to multilateral organizations, we are already doing quite a bit in this area, and I would point out for Indonesia, what is particularly valuable is the recent Indonesian agreement with Vietnam to settle their disagreements over the EEZ, and that settlement is a model that should be emulated, or that we should support other Southeast Asian countries to do, because it shows that we can, or rather U.S. allies and partners can settle disputes peacefully in the South China Sea. And that is a clear pushback against China's claims in the South China Sea, the 9-9 claims. As for Japan, I would recommend that given all the major shifts that we're seeing since this December in terms of Japan's national defense strategy and whatnot, your trip comes at a very pivotal point to really understand what direction Japan is taking. And we had discussed earlier that Japan is likely one of the few countries that Taiwan can probably depend on more among U.S. allies for its defense.
Thank you. And you touched on this. I think that there are current cooperation agreements that we can expand upon, and there are new partnerships we should pursue to ensure stability in the Indo-Pacific region. I also think we need to look at what's happening in Europe, specifically the war of choice in Ukraine. And so my next question, Dr. Lynn, and to both Dr. Lynn and Dr. Hill, building on what Dr. Lynn was just talking about with working with our Asian partners to expand more of these partnerships and agreements. With only a few exceptions, many countries in Southeast Asia have not joined in sanctioning Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. And many of them are watching what's happening in Russia and gaining a different lessons learned for what that means for them, whether it's Taiwan, whether it is, for freedom of navigation in the South, in the Indo-Pacific region. What message or actions help convince our non-European allies and partners to condemn Russian action? And conversely, what message and action resonate with European allies and partners as a counter to CCP malign activity? How do we get more of our engagement with Europe and to get our European partners to understand that the Indo-Pacific region is important to them too?
Right, so in terms of getting more Asian allies and partners on board to sanction Russia, I think part of it is also trying to understand what is holding them back. Is it because they are very dependent on Russian arms? Is it because they're dependent on certain types of trade with Russia? So to the extent that we can decrease their dependency on Russia, I think that is a way in which we could shift their perspective, because there's something holding them back. I think most countries recognize that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a clear atrocity and something that they oppose. But it's getting them to the sanctions step that we need to work on.
Dr. Hill?
I agree completely with Dr. Lynn. I think part of the issue that we face, not just in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere, is a lot of countries are values neutral when they look at this. So we have to clarify what's at risk. It's not autocracy versus democracy, because they can constantly challenge that. It's really the violation of territorial integrity. So when Dr. Lynn was talking about the importance of us helping Indonesia and Vietnam to work out their territorial disputes, this is what we have to clarify for countries in other regions. European countries are stepping up to try to make this point too. It's the point that Finland and Sweden are making as they seek to join NATO. Poland, the Baltic states, other countries are expressing their deep concern, and that this is also a problem in the Indo-Pacific region. India, for example, is a really important country to engage on this, and I hope that members of this committee will think about going to India. I know you already have had meetings with Indian officials, because India faces territorial disputes, not just with Pakistan, but also with China in the Himalayas. And India is wondering, what are we going to do if, in the event of another outbreak of conflict there, for example, just as other countries around Asia are wondering what our posture is going to be on these issues. That's what we have to clarify.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Schmidt is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And would say that I'm very proud to be on this committee. Missouri's had a long history of service on this committee, and look forward to working with all my fellow committee members. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion of China, and rightfully so. And as part of their ambition to project power across the world, they have been more aggressive in building military bases and partnerships with countries like Sri Lanka and the Solomon Islands, Cambodia, and a lot of Chinese firms now own and operate assets in 96 ports in 53 countries, all of which can be used to establish logistics and intelligence networks and strategic locations, enabling China to project its power globally. This network poses significant threats to the United States and our allies, there's no doubt about that, particularly if China can cut off access that our military needs during difficult times or times of conflict. I guess, Mr. Zakheim, maybe direct this to you initially, because I don't have a ton of time. I want to get through at least a couple of questions. What specific actions should the Department of Defense undertake to ensure that China does not gain further access to ports throughout the world, especially in the South China Sea?
Thank you, Senator. I think the critical thing for the Department of Defense, there are other pieces for a government to deal with China's reach globally in the ways you've described, is that we need to push out our logistics capability. The notion that somehow we're going to rely on shipping or transport aircraft to deliver forces, material to the battlefield like we did in the last century is not going to happen. And that's why I think you see some of these memos coming out for those military leaders focused on pre-positioning, on the transcom type issues are most concerned, because it's about getting there first with speed and making sure the kill chain is not reliant on pulling back a capability, an ocean plus away.
And then, while we're talking about China, which I certainly believe is our biggest threat, what do they believe is their biggest weakness in a potential conflict with a foreign adversary, particularly the United States? How do they view that?
I continue to believe, and I defer to Dr. Lynn here, I know studies this as well, is that our undersea capability is something that I think spooks them. That's the one I start with, is why I think we need to double down on it. They don't have the answer. The quicker we can move from manned to unmanned, as well as sustaining the current manned capability, is our comparative advantage, and we should be investing in that in a significant, urgent, speedy fashion.
Senator, I think one of the Chinese don't say this quite explicitly. I think one of their biggest weaknesses that they see is actually their personnel, because they unlike the United States, where we have had a significant experience fighting different types of wars, they have had very limited fighting experience. Even though they have the equipment, there's no guarantee that transitioning from even a large-scale exercise to a minor conflict, they would be successful, much less a very high-end contingency, one of the most complex operations we can think about in terms of the Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan.
I just open this up to all three of you for probably the last question that I have time for, but you've all spoken about threats of foreign actors, especially in Western Asia. One concern that I have is that we remain focused on obviously those important threats, but might ignore threats closer to home, to our own borders. What action should the department take to protect our national interests in the Western Hemisphere, specifically the southern border and in the Panama Canal Zone? And by the way, how should we engage Central and South America in some of these efforts?
Yes, I mean, that was obviously picks up on the question that Senator Kane raised, and, I analysed the problem, but actually Mr. Zakheim came up with a few solutions here in terms of our relationships with some of those critical countries. I think we need to assess the strength of our relationships with our Western Hemisphere allies, thinking about how we can capitalise on the recent presidential visit to Brazil, and how Brazil can play a larger role, not just in the region, but internationally because of its role in the BRICS relationship with China and Russia and India. Thinking about our relations with Mexico, the health of that relationship overall, not just as Mexico as a problem, but how this can be strengthened as an alliance and as a relationship going forward. I think we need to have a whole scale assessment of the nature of our military, diplomatic, trade, as Mr. Zakheim relationships said, and pay particular attention to those countries where China and also Russia have penetrated in terms of their military or intelligence investments, for example.
I just add, Senator, that Plan Colombia was a great success. I think what I've read and in conversation, that's at risk. That's a model that needs to be replicated, and we need to strengthen it in Colombia, and that's coming at the military security cooperation plane, and I think it would have the effects that you rightfully point out we need in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Let me recognize Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we often talk about the role of aircraft carriers and hypersonic weapons excuse me, in the great power competition. But I'd like to zero in on what people bring to the fight, specifically our military personnel. Leaders in the People's Republic of China have repeatedly raised concerns that they lack personnel who are both capable and highly skilled for modern warfare. A report for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission found that, quote, many People's Liberation Army commanders are still judged as incapable of properly assessing situations, making operational decisions, deploying forces, or leading forces, unquote. We don't want to underestimate China's capabilities, but that is a pretty sorry state of affairs. Dr. Lynn, you are an expert on China, and you were the senior advisor advising the Department of Defense in both the Obama and Trump administrations. So tell me, Dr. Lynn, how important are personnel in winning on the battlefield?
Thank you, Senator Warren. The personnel is absolutely important. As you indicated, and as I mentioned earlier to Senator Schmidt, I think that is one of the major weaknesses that the Chinese assess to be within their PLA. They aren't worried about whether they can get another, for example, Dongfeng 41 missile or another submarine. They're worried about whether their personnel can perform, so absolutely critical.
Okay, people. But after years of having forces that have little more than a 9th grade education, PRC is now starting to attract significantly more educated recruits. Dr. Lynn, how successful has the PLA been at retaining more skilled troops?
So you are correct in saying that China, the PLA is attracting more educated PLA recruits, but we don't really have really good statistics on how they are in terms of retaining them. But I would say that the respect for the PLA broadly in China is nowhere close to the respect for the U.S. military in the United States.
It's an interesting point on this because unlike the Chinese government, we actually care about our people. Still, we have our own recruiting and retention challenges here at home. For example, U.S. military families living in unsafe housing or struggling to access health care that they need. So I'm looking forward to working on the personnel subcommittee with Senator Scott to tackle these problems. Dr. Lynn, if the United States substantially disinvested in the programs we have to support our military workforce, things like access to child care and violence prevention programs, would that help us or hurt us in our effort to maintain a competitive advantage over China when it comes to the quality of our personnel?
I think it would definitely hurt us. Having worked with many military officers, I know how difficult it is to be able to sacrifice for the nation while also taking care of needs at home. So without that, without the United States government helping them with the child care, the home portion, I think it makes their day jobs much more difficult.
Good, and I see our other witnesses both nodding yes as well. Do I take it you both agreed on this?
We certainly do, and look, we can see the performance of the Russian military at this moment is a case in point, a country that does not care about the quality of its personnel, only the quantity that can be thrown at the battlefield. And all of the issues that you've just raised are one of the reasons why Russia has not been performing as we might have expected.
Yeah. You know, go ahead, Mr. Zakheim.
I completely agree, Senator Warren, and one of the things this committee does annually when they report out the defense authorization bills, what it's done for the men and women in uniform. I think that's the example and why we're able to realize these benefits.
Yeah. I raise this today in this context because some Republicans want to cut programs that support our troops and our military families. You know, they talk about fiscal responsibility, but I see two big problems. First, anyone who's using a debate over the nation's debt limit to crash our economy in order to extract massive spending cuts is being reckless, not responsible. But second, make no mistake, the same folks who claim to care about the size of the Pentagon budget will continue to give a blank check for weapons programs that go to billions of dollars of cost and not to our personnel. The Pentagon funding these Republicans want to cut is the part that goes to safe housing and medical care for our troops. I get it. There's plenty of waste to cut in the Pentagon's budget, but programs that support our troops and inspire them to continue to put their lives on the line for our country aren't waste. They protect our greatest strength as a nation, our people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Wicker, you have additional questions, please.
Right, I'm going to take a short second round. You've all been extremely helpful, and it's been a very informative but long 2.5 hours for you, and I know you're anxious to get up. In terms, Mr. Zakheim, in terms of our stake as American families in the Ukraine conflict, we've heard arguments. This is an assault on the global rules-based order. Russia has violated the UN chapter. It's a violation of international law. In addition, there's the 1994 agreement that the United States made when Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. There are going to be a lot of families who say that's not enough for me. I'm trying to get my kids ready for college. My spouse and I both work. I'm furious about the border. Inflation is killing me. And why should my tax dollars, how does it affect me and my family where I live, that we are so interested in Ukraine defeating Russia in this? What's our stake?
Thank you, Senator Wicker. I think the response is, let's not be a penny wise and pound foolish. Ukraine winning means that we do not have a broader armed conflict in Europe. History is clear. The cost to America with a war on the continent could be so consequential, it takes over the entire country in the form of some World War-like effort. That's the difference, in my judgment, between allowing Vladimir Putin and his revanchist ambitions to have whatever they want in Europe versus not putting a single U.S. boot on the ground, investing in the Ukrainians along with our allies to allow them to do essentially our work for us, that is to defeat an adversary.
So it's going to save that family tax money down the road.
And potentially lives, Senator.
Dr. Hill?
I agree completely with Mr. Zakheim about this as well. And Senator Cotton, while he was opening up for his question, invoked Winston Churchill. You know, this august body had debates about whether the United States should continue to support the United Kingdom before the United States' entry into World War II, back in the period from 1939 to 1941, in fact.
Indeed, it was controversial.
Exactly, yes. And so I think it's the same kind of debate about the knock-on effects for all of us. And just one issue about the borders. The kinds of attacks that Russia has made on another country and its borders lead to more refugees and migrants. We've seen that. In fact, we do have Russians, Ukrainians, and others coming over the southern border who've, taken roundabout routes to get here. We are now going to face, on a global scale, more of these kinds of violations. We've got a massive refugee and migration problem across the entire globe. Climate change is going to exacerbate this. We're going to be dealing with problems on the border from here on.
I have to hurry. Mr. Zakheim, you make a point that one of the worst wastes of money being pound foolish is a CR, a continuing resolution. Would you explain why that is?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for giving me a chance, because I didn't get to your reform question earlier. This Congress thinks all about how you deal with waste and inefficiency in the Department of Defense enterprise of $800 billion, with the Congress year over year. I know this is not the choice of this committee, but going on a CR, not allowing the budget that the Department of Defense has requested to be executed and forcing them, boxing them into previous year's requests, raises this inefficiency where you're spending money, authorizing appropriated funds on things that the Congress doesn't want them to spend on, the Department of Defense doesn't want them to spend on, all because of this larger context that has happened for decades, year over year. The exception is when we don't have a CR, and it translates into tens of billions of dollars annually of inefficient spending of taxpayer money, sir.
And one other thing. It seems to me the Russian offensive of this late winter has bogged down and is not likely to succeed any further. Would you comment on that?
I think that's still a question. It certainly hasn't proceeded at the pace that Vladimir Putin would have liked. But as Dr. Hill and others pointed out, Putin keeps on putting people, personnel, and capability forward. What the Ukrainians need is the ability to strike through it and attack it from the rear. That's what I understand from military professionals. And they don't have that capability right now. And it risks allowing the Russians to advance inch by inch, foot by foot. And Vladimir Putin has the patience, so far the ability, to do just that.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. I want to thank the panel for an excellent hearing and presentation and commend you for your work. Thank you very, very much. With that, let me call this hearing to be adjourned.
Thank you, Jack.
Oh, Roger. Thank you.